Hello everyone, today we talk about something different from the usual, that is to say, a video critique of actually, an interesting, good video by the famed Shadiversity, medieval history enthusiast and in part expert, as we will see now, titled Medieval Misconceptions, Battlefield in cap locks, Tactics, Units, and Formations in minuscule. And this video was made essentially almost 2 years ago, so I'm not running after bigger channels for any specific sake. I make thousands of videos without doing that. This may be a beginning, by the way. Just I don't like drama, and of course, even though I have a general generally positive bias towards this the aforementioned channel that I'd never really thoroughly followed, like most channels in the first place, especially as far as medieval warfare is concerned. And in general, I don't watch that kind of content. First of all, because I work with it, and so I don't even want to use that as saying, here's me speaking, where I come from, what I do, etc. So this is not the point. Most of what I do on YouTube is disclosure, and that's essentially also what these channels really do. At the end of the day, YouTube is probably an underrated platform as far as the potential of explaining such topics is concerned. And of course, also Shadiversity has surely plenty of videos discussing more thoroughly certain topics that are also indicated in that video. So the reason why I make this video here is to, in fact, as a disclosure, trying to refine, say, certain concepts, and sometimes also correcting something I disagree with. In this broader explanation, it's 30 minutes long. The author is pretty fair and open by saying, in 30 minutes you can't really get too much in depth, and so it's just a general presentation for a general audience that is interested in medieval warfare. So I thought it interesting. I don't know how many views it has. I think I don't know, but it can be even more than 1 million, or we are in the hundreds of thousands, because it's a very successful channel. And so I thought that the effect of certain things that are said, and even just the broader frame and some general perspective, is very interesting to comment on, because eventually people absorb the same background, the same bias that we all have, and somewhat digest it very often their own way, because also that we all do. But let's say somebody with some medieval warfare knowledge coming from a certain background says certain things, and he may be right and wrong more or less about certain things. Shadiversity's video is relatively uncontroversial, right? He says some, kind of, in fact, basic things you can agree on. Other things, again, I would like to comment further on. But say the audience, and I know better even with a much smaller channel and having read so many comments and observed general trends, still will, first of all, not get even a good, half of it, and that the other half will be chewed and spit in kind of a different form, and eventually people, in fact, read and listen to things and simply go out there and create noise, and very often without the adequate compass to make this noise fruitful for a further fruition. So it's obvious that my role is the one of the a-hole in some way in this context, because I wouldn't like somebody began to comment on my channel saying strange things, for example, that I may have misunderstood myself also about Shadiversity's content or whatever. But I still think that, given this is what I do, at least in a quite specific sense, because I specialize exactly in these topics, that an insight can open some, not even a discussion, but just participating to the debate, that is quite important. And for those who don't know the video, of course they can't watch it. I think I insert here the same title, so it will be easy to find. And it's a introduction, right? A very general introduction to the aforementioned topics, right? Battlefields, formations, tactics, units, etc. For an audience, that this is the first thing I want to notice. That again, it's not, let's say a negative criticism. It's just an observation of how these things really happen. And I made plenty of videos about these topics because I find them actually dreadfully interesting. I mean, the fact that the author of the video addresses whoever wants, of course, to know medieval warfare, but has a special reference for medieval fantasy writers, right? Now, this is absolutely fair. Like, it's obvious, and in fact, I know that even on my channel, people comment very often. They say, "Oh, see, I'm writing a book. It's a novel set up," and it's always, believe me, so far different people from different backgrounds. This is just 15th century Burgundy, right? That's the standard of medieval history in that kind of. If you want, it's a bit of a northwestern or even Anglosphere bias of some sort, being fascinated with the next useful exotic. Most, say, closest thing it can be Burgundy in its magnificence in the 15th century and all, but let's say I never heard anyone say, "I'm setting this novel in 8th century Bulgaria, or in 11th century Galicia, or in 14th century Greater Poland." No, it has to be always the 15th century kind of gloomy forested area with half-timbered houses and full plate armor, right? Otherwise, it's not Middle Ages, and this is what, say, a lot of medievalism, in my opinion, revolves around, and that's a problem I've always had with fantasy in general that I thoroughly disliked ever since I can remember, part because my historical interests derive from, first of all, some direct or at least mediated contact with direct historical sources or studies, even in my family and so on, and also because I had my own fantasy about these things, and I never enjoyed things like, I don't know, Lord of the Rings, or in at least in movie rendition, or I don't know, Game of Thrones, Vikings. I think that those fundamentally are a bit of niche of some sort of maniacal and deeply misguided, culturally speaking, people who believe that that's fundamentally the aestheticistic, medievalistic mode that I think fits pretty much with the kind of alienation and rejection of the world and reality as it is by people that rather fail to understand reality as such, and therefore also the historical one. And I don't really mean it, as you know, in that kind of myth-busting attitude that seem to get a lot. I just talk about history plainly, and yes, there's always some myth to bust. Maybe even today, and the same Shadiversity's video is actually, structured along that pattern. Here, Hollywood makes bullshit, and other people think like this, and it's not really the thing. Yeah, I also make that sometimes, but that just dialectically, I like to understand the psychological reasons that exist behind that ignorance, right? I don't stop to, okay, well, that's wrong, so let's trash it. Let's understand why people reason like that, and why they get these misconceptions. I find it, as I started, much more interesting. But of course, this is not Shadiversity's aim. I'm not criticizing that at all. I would like to maintain, in fact, this video is as dry, as clean as possible. It's just that there is so much provided exactly by channels like this for thought that it's really impossible not to digress on things that apparently are not connected, but that really are in the end, because it all revolves around that. In any case, that's the point. I mean, I wonder why this would be specifically interesting for medieval fantasy writers, right? What's the role of medieval fantasy writers in the growth of our civilization, especially in such a critical moment where, I believe people should be ever more rooted into reality. In this sense, yes, giving an advice to somebody writing fiction in the first place about the historicity of a certain context, but still kind of acknowledging that not just medieval history, but specifically medieval fantasy is supposed to be a thing is very distant from my mindset, from my background, and I thoroughly don't understand, again, how it's even possible to get in such a thing. I have my reasons, again, that if you go in my Historian playlist, I list at some point, and I don't want to repeat myself because I always sound grumpy and bitchy about this, but let's say there are problems, there are issues in our culture, and these very often do pass through these kind of, fictionalism and necessity of, let's say, expressing something that doesn't really, looks like a pointless exercise of some sort, where you have the actual reality in front of you to sort out historically, to write fantasy, as opposed to even kind of just trying to set the thing in an actual historical context, even though, of course, imagination can be unrestrained. But let's say if you want to even separate yourself from things that look as they would supposed to look and not what they actually look, right? The way is only history and real history. So what Shadiversity is doing in this sense is the right direction as well. However, a first thing that starts here, and in the video, he's mostly discusses battle tactics and formations, and say exemplifying the various arms and their diversity. I mean, the differences existing between heavy and light, and the role that cavalry, missile, and infantry play. There is some balance there. In my opinion, the author is biased in favor of missile. Let's say, or at least he overstates some kind of capacities of missile troops. And the reason being, of course, that coming from mostly an Anglo-Saxon background, he lists just all the possible examples: Hastings, Crecy, Azincourt, Bannockburn. Right, you don't hear else. And I understand that, of course, also probably his audience is from the Anglosphere, as mine is, by the way. But, hearing a bit about Bouvines, Muret, Markfeld, Tagliacozzo, Montecatini, these are, some very, just to remain confined at least in the core of Western Europe, it's somehow important, right, for having a broader outlook on warfare. So this kind of narrowing down to mostly England and surroundings, which I thoroughly like and appreciate, and I actually should make much more videos on, and that I just recently made a video about English warfare. I made multiple ones, and I will keep making them hopefully, is particularly useful because the purpose of that video is, of course, to expand the horizons of people. And so I believe that even a broader military, say, geography and chronology is really fundamental, because the art of war is necessarily diachronic and comparative. And while I realize that 30 minutes are too few not to use easy reference to mostly an Anglosphere reference, I mean, you don't even need to be, I don't know, a British or American. I mean, maybe an Indian just knows much better, medieval warfare through an English lens, unavoidably, as opposed to whatever. It can be a Central European one, a Southern European one, an Eastern European one, or whatever. But the point is not this. The point is more strictly about the various arms and the assessments that Shadiversity makes here. First of all, he draws an interesting distinction between spear or shield walls, right? And the point he makes to divide this is, you can have literally, this says at the beginning of the video, like something like, a spear or a shield wall. At least I realize that this video is somewhat generic and that doesn't have time to enter into the minutiae of it all. But I think, first of all, this is an actual misconception. I mean, we have to always go by approximation when we teach things, but let's say starting from the general repartition of saying things, what is important to appreciate for a beginner about the various arms is either spear walls or shield walls. First of all, to me is already, first of all, not important. Even if I understand what the distinction is, that at least the author wants to make, but that this does not quite exist even as such, because there is no such thing in warfare like, say, just a wall of shields or a wall of spears, right? Even in depth in the video, he talks about Hastings, about the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, which is a term we can use, of course, to say evocatively, to say, okay, think about the shield wall, what this kind of actually means, which is really a normal heavy infantry, mostly in the age, spearman formation, right? That also incidentally had shields like basically any other heavy infantry, unless we're not talking about times in which full plate armor had rendered the shield practically obsolete. And so, say, the author expresses a sort of functionalization of two things, especially in function, again, of his favorite arm, apparently, that is the missile one. I'm joking about the favorite part, but I will explain later why I say this. That is specifically to say that a spear wall, like a schiltron, he makes the example, so mostly pikemen, would be more vulnerable to missile fire, because given you have to hold the pike with both hands, here allegedly wouldn't have to wear a shield, which is also not really correct. I come across some of the greatest developments in medieval warfare before actually the full, square pikes of the Swiss that are more famous, talking about 13th, 14th century. Most of what we call pikemen actually, and probably at least this is something that we're still researching on, but did wear shields, also of significant protection that could be slung across the shoulders. It was a, quite extensive practice, as you know, through gauges and so on, and also in cavalry, to keep also on horseback the shield, having to hold the bridle and the weapon at the same time. It was a bit the same thing. And exemplifying said the shield wall, as if to say a unit, an infantry unit equipped mostly with, yes, with other weapons, as it says on the piece about Hastings, but mostly having these large shields that would be so much more effective against missile fire. So, in my experience in medieval warfare, I must say this again, that the distinction does not make sense. I mean, the effectiveness of heavy infantry as an arm is primarily its stopping power against other formations, especially cavalry, if we're talking about predominance of, in fact, mounted warfare during the Middle Ages, which is carried out primarily, especially against cavalry, actually exclusively through pikes. Like, if you want to stop any cavalry charge, it's not halberds, it's not other polearms, it's not swords, it's exclusively pikes, right? Of course, the thing comes into combined arms when we're actually witnessing, in fact, that heavy infantry cooperated with missile one, that is essentially a light one, right? Technically, missile infantry is not even an arm per se, right? You have heavier and lighter cavalry and do different things. In this sense, we should conceptually equate the effectiveness that a spear can make, whether it's, for example, held or thrown, as it's more likely, as you know, in early medieval warfare than in later times. But the point of distinguishing spear walls and shield walls is basically meaning that there is such a thing like a shield wall as opposed to a spear wall. This thing does not exist. There are only spear walls, and there are also shields, and that are also useful to stop missile. But the point of heavy infantry per se is exactly relative in function of what is lighter than it. Right, when we talk about heavy or light infantry, we're not talking of absolute heaviness throughout history. Just recently we made that video about the old Middle Kingdom infantry. We see the heavy infantryman is a guy that literally doesn't have any form of armor and just has an axe and a shield. That is to say, literally is the guy that gets in the melee. For those times, that was actually ultra heavy infantry, right? And that would have, looked ridiculous just 2,000 years later. Right, in that sense, but still, don't think that there were even enormous differences, especially the earlier the times, in the actual, heaviness in this regard of infantry per se. We're not stating, of course, that armor, too, is the primary defense that you actually really get. Like, the shield is mostly an auxilium that allows you, of course, to defend yourself pretty effectively in the aforementioned circumstances, but at the end of the day, for heavy infantry specifically, most of your defense stands either properly in the collective formation, that is to say, especially a pikeman formation owes its best defense to the solidity of the formation per se, and so not making enemies penetrating inside that. It's just like saying, why do missile troops that engage regularly against missile troops are so light? Well, because their best protection is the volume of fire they inflict on the enemy, and so it's just like in steppes warfare that we'll partly talk about that because he exemplifies something about the Mongols. Without descending to the obvious political and social reasons why those peoples fought the way they did, which doesn't interest us for today, well, arrows were everywhere, and just essentially the elite wore substantial armor, which is debatable by a certain degree because, of course, there was some kind of middle ground there. But the vast majority of archers, depending, again, on the people and other things, but generally speaking, were practically unarmored. And yet they were constantly under enemy fire. And again, you understand that the collective dimension there has its own greater functionality. Shield walls, in this sense, do not exist. You don't stop a charge with shields, nor you actually hammer the enemy down with shields. Yes, you can't do that. You can break, somebody's feet with an umbo. You can do lots of interesting things, and shields also have partly that kind of offensive capacity. But fundamentally, you kill people. You offend with any form, in fact, of offensive weapon. So I don't like very much that idea that, in fact, as we will see now, probably Shadiversity derives from a bias, right? Let's say an overstatement of the missile troops' capacity, as if infantry, generally speaking, were, say, vulnerable to archers in the first place. And don't get me wrong, because at the beginning he makes very clear that you cannot evaluate these arms without specifying their heaviness or lightness, just saying, like paper, rocks, and scissors, like cavalry takes out archers, and archers take out infantry, and infantry takes out cavalry. First of all, it's not true just, for the preeminence of cavalry in the battlefield in medieval times and their decisiveness, even for some centuries. But the solid point that should be made is that, given also we're talking about essentially big battles, right? So large engagements, pitched battles, generally speaking. That's the place where, at least in Western warfare, you find heavy infantry concentrated, and there is no way of just light missile or light infantry in general to take out heavy infantry, because that's exactly what the point is, that heavy infantry cannot be taken out by light infantry. It's what makes it heavy as opposed to the light one that can take it out, right? So you do not find in medieval warfare essentially an army of archers taking out an army of cavalry or infantry, right? It doesn't happen like that, because light infantry doesn't have this role. You need heavy infantry or heavy cavalry to carry that out. And I would like to stress that actually Shadiversity starts with a relatively thing of pitched battles with a distinction. The fact that there are lots of skirmishers that are very important both strategically and tactically, because they essentially pave the way for battles, and they're very relevant. They're not showed in movies that are taken here a bit as, where most people legitimately take, or video games take most of their medieval or warfare information from in the first place. So obviously the cut of this video is also the same of Shadiversity. I mean, we're talking essentially about pitched battles. So moments that, as we've seen in the Clausewitzian theory, are essentially the culminating point of most campaigns, or at least that are marking very specific strategical changes for which, in fact, the tactical engagement is designed in the first place, where you have to actually kill the enemy, right? Where it really gets down to. Most of the things I disagree with Shadiversity actually have to do exactly with the mortality of medieval battles, that it claims to be relatively low. I understand why he says that, but it's actually a myth buster that has become actually a myth in itself, because it's actually not true. Medieval battles were extremely bloody, and they actually have nothing to envy to any other, right? It's a misconception to properly understand it, as Shadiversity says, that since there is artillery around today, there is a higher mortality in actual combat, because he makes the point that, of course, medical technology, as he calls it, it makes people dying in much lesser numbers than, medieval ones, where just an infection could take you out after a while. But this is not true. This is not true as it's been historiographically assessed. I could quote Contamine that makes gives some figures there. I studied my pretty large share of medieval battles, and I realized that medieval warfare was incredibly bloody, and that it wasn't the norm to have, from smaller to larger engagements, 10%, 20% is a lot, right? And it is a lot also for contemporary warfare, for any kind of warfare, right? And these percentages just do not really vary over time. I mean, I'm sure there can be a study made by people who should take data, with a method that they should explain from all the eras, and you could spot some kind of structural differences. But first of all, this is a crucial point that I think the video should have pointed out. It's also how do we know what we know, which is the entire point of history. And very often we are differently documented in history, and we could be even, and as it happens normally, say comparing various eras, figures can be very difficult in of itself, because of the type of information that we really have, and the extreme complexity, in fact, that revolves around their interpretation, as opposed to an art of war that really shows you that concentration of forces that eventually are broken in a battle and are pursued and butchered, at the end of the day, looks pretty much the same throughout all warfare, right? And this difference really it's not helpful, because it doesn't, first of all, it's not true, but and thus it generates some misunderstandings about the nature of medieval warfare, right? I understand there are people who come from an idea that everything medieval was dark, bloody, and thing, as if it was more than other eras. That's bad, but saying, medieval warfare was less bloody, say, the modern era, because there is artillery later, I'm sorry, but it doesn't make any sense, right? First of all, it's not true, but secondly, it just, there is no reason for it, because the political motivation and moral forces involved are practically all the same, and people go on the battlefield to kill primarily, and getting killed in the process, and yes, they do get killed, right? Much more easily than one normally thinks. So warfare is very interesting from a psychological point of view, but exactly because it does go against the instinct of survival. So it's hardly anything that you can simply say, well, since I want to survive, I will fight war less bloodily. That can happen if you're not motivated, but the entire military history shows you that basically every people, every culture, every country is able to get themselves killed in general circumstances that make you do so, right? Which is something that Shadiversity also, refers to, actually, indirectly, when he talks about, for example, some forces on the field that take even more losses than the enemy, but in fact, exactly for this reason, I would say, are more resilient, and maybe even if they are disadvantaged, manage, say, to take out the enemy commander. And this causes a domino effect, morally speaking, on the enemy army. They are able to win, even having taken more losses during combat, which does happen, except there is the moment of the retreat and of the pursuit that he doesn't talk about much. And as we will see, he will say, well, medieval battles mostly ended up in retreat, surrender, etc. Well, which warfare in history doesn't actually end like this, right? Again, even along that pattern, actually, medieval battles follow the same line of any other battle. There is essentially a pocket of troops that resist till the end, also to allow the others to flee, and mostly the overwhelming majority of losses happen during the pursuit, which basically does happen all the time. And something that Shadiversity says, like, the enemy could reform at some point. Yes, it's true, it's a thing, but, when you actually wipe out a great part of the enemy forces in the field, you have caused a moral effect that most of it, and around which the entire purpose of warfare revolves around, that annihilates and, greatly reduces any possibility of the enemy actually even wanting to fight again. And, so things can happen. We all agree on the fact that, just like Shadiversity does, that everything is extremely complex. It doesn't mean that there is not a trend and that there is not some even kind of universal behavior, especially when it gets down to certain things like properly crude combat and killing, which warfare, again, is pretty, standard in the ways of doing it, in spite of the different weapons or the different tactics and so on. Conceptual warfare gets down to that, right? And it does happen like that. So there is a point that he makes using some Lego props, Lego-like props at least, explaining the, let's say, the sophistication and complexity of the difference in battle lines depth and width, right? He basically uses these two rectangles, he puts them on the side, he forms a line, says, look, if I have the same amount of troops, I have the line which is larger, wider, then I can instead put them one behind another and have a narrower front and a deeper formation. Fine. What happens though during the video, and I say this for anybody was watching it and says, yeah, it makes sense that the narrative along the video is not focusing on the concept of multiple lines of battle. That is to say, doesn't seem to mean that half an hour there is any reference to the fact that, yes, you can have a single battle line that you can play this kind of depth or width like in the way it's simple math, right? But that actually most battles did that on a multiple line scale. That is to say, it was not much the depth of a single battle line, but the multiplicity of battle lines separated from each other, sometimes even normally from what I've seen, half a kilometer, to avoid domino effect in case of the collapse of the front ones, but still at a say close enough for allowing kind of intervention in some circumstances, because again the point was not actually supporting the various lines. The various lines were tactically autonomous formations that were to remain separated from one another. Right, what they had to be close for is realizing what was going on in the first place and assessing and concentrating forces, given even some kind of confidence in the troops of the anterior lines that could break, knowing that they had somebody to run to, and just being more updated on what was happening on the field. Right, that Shadiversity recognizes, especially talking about the importance of elevated ground, for which you can have a broader visual, right? But the entire video does not refer to this line multiplicity. It simply talks as if, I realize it's a simplification, that he just talks about how much a single unit can be deployed with a wider or more restricted front, and in fact a larger or narrower depth. And how this does have important tactical effects, but if you look at medieval warfare, what you realize is that first of all, how deep the actual battle lines were, we have no idea of. Like sources normally do not tell us, right? We have often this positional sources that tell us how many men there were within a unit. Sometimes, especially towards the late Middle Ages, we are informed about the depth. There was probably, by analogy, some universality of some kind of 8 rows dip, which was something since Xenophon. The thing could change naturally, depending, again, on the culture, on the army, on the people, on the tactic, and the specific battle that is always different, but does maintain this kind of bigger rules, let's say. And not talking, in fact, about the single most important thing about tactics, that is to say, the pre-ordered employment of reserves, the fact that battle lines were used exactly to manage the battlefield in a way for which it was given for granted that the first lines would have had to be exhausted and to melt away at some point, and the the greatest tactical game that was really played in medieval warfare, as actually in ancient warfare and others, was exactly this alternation of the battle lines. And none of this is actually addressed, and we will get to the point at which he actually refers to, well, we can't discuss it now, regarding the Roman triplex ages, which is here, described also with a sort of mutatio that, in fact, does not take in consideration the separated battle lines, what their actual role is, and is taken just for some sort of idea that the, units were, the thicker they were, the more the first ranks of the first line could be replaced easily. In actually most warfare, the men of the first ranks are literally the best you've got. If those break, most of the times the entire unit is in peril, because those are the men who are specifically chosen to lead the file, and that the others are habituated to just follow in combat. And so you cannot simply, say, well, okay, we will just make advance the guys from the posterior ranks, because it's basically the same, and the deeper the formation is, the more you can replace them. The thing is extremely complicated. There is, again, an internal disposition of the men within a unit that cannot be simply changed. Like, there can't be actually much of a there's not really much movement of units other than essentially advancing towards the enemy in any kind of battle, right? Outflanking maneuvers are carried out sometimes very accidentally, or let's say with lesser order, and they mostly happen just when basically the entire solidity of the enemy formation is already compromised in some way. We will talk about this later, because I also prepare the ground for what he says later, so that it's easier to understand what we're discussing in the first place. So again, this aspect, again, for some random watcher, listener, may be slightly misleading, or at least missing the broader point of the alternation of the battle lines in combat, which is a big thing and happens once at a time, maintaining also the traditional principles of mass and of also unit of command, right, of simplicity in the first place, and that were based on the actual knowledge, yes, that entire units would have been wiped out during the battle, right, or that would have been broken, right, and so of course the majority of them would have not been killed, right, but that of course at the end of the battle somebody had to stand like with a solid lines, so being able to crush the last one. And in this sense, the freshness of reserves was really crucial, and that's what most warfare really revolves around, and including medieval warfare is basically the pivotal point, right? So another aspect which is fair enough, but that may be conceptually framed in some kind of more precise way, especially for the sake of clarity from a theoretical point of view, is the fact that supplies are indicated by Shadiversity as crucial for the battle itself. I mean, of course, battles occur within a campaign, so there is an operational theater, there is a strategic situation, there is an attacker and a defender. He makes the point that, of course, the territory under attack, like if it's, say, under an invader attack, is capable of providing more easily supplies to the defender in a way. And there is a broader strategic advantage in that. Yes, it is true. However, things can also get pretty blurred. So again, I'm going a bit actually against my own point that there is a structure in things, because the incredible complexity, especially the political fragmentation of a normal campaign situation, where most armies were also essentially coalition forces of some kind, and they were somewhat unstable by a certain degree, and in territories dotted with literally hundreds of castles and other centers that even interfered with the same battlefield sometimes, etc., makes you realize that yes, supplies are important, but they're a bit important for everyone. So that when you're going into battle, of course, it's important whether you have eaten enough in the previous days, whether you are, risking to be cut off and so on. And normally, the larger the army and the more the supply lines are intact, right? This is the point that I would like to stress. The narrower, the smaller the engagement, the crazier the outcome compared to the odds can be. But when we're talking about massive pitch battles, the terrain, about which Shadiversity insists a lot, and its advantages and so on, rightfully, by the way, and the supplies and so on, is important, but it doesn't. It's not something that you can historically track in the way it affects the tactics of that battle. Because in that situation, again, the fact that there is an army of, say, 30,000 men standing against one another of the same size, and that's basically the most you find in medieval warfare, especially Western warfare, where there was a lot of cost and quality attached after all to the single. I'm talking mostly about late Middle Ages, single troops, but we're talking about, in fact, large amounts of heavy infantry. I mean, not like in the East, where you could find more raiders coming from anywhere, and literally you didn't even need to prepare them, the logistics for them, because they would just loot and sustain themselves living off the land in many ways. But let's say it's already there. The army, if you have a 30,000 army standing, it's because you have your supply lines secure in some way. You can oblige an enemy to retreat if you cut them, and this does happen. So it's true, etc. But the way this pertains to the battle is relative to the strategic background, right? So you should consider it, but realizing that when two armies are already standing on their feet and are willing to go into battle, it's because they have enough resources to afford that, right? Even if the situation is desperate and always critical, right? But I've personally never found, studying also pretty well documented times in early 14th century warfare, tens of battles, not even one said that, these guys fought wars because they hadn't eaten. Right? I literally never find that. And medieval sources, generally speaking, also in other times and periods, hardly ever talk about this. Because, again, this is the misconception that mostly happens, that in order to explain the complexity of the system, you just basically root for some important factors, but that become somewhat isolated from the rest. So it's obvious that logistics is important, but for example, in the art of war, logistics has literally nothing to do with tactics or strategy. It's the way really this affects the course of the campaign is, for example, having to place your army in an area, in fact, in which you're well supplied, which is also what Shadiversity says. But let's say the logistic capacity there could be managed in the way food literally arrives, supplies arrive from elsewhere, by even a civilian, right? So in the theory of the art of war, we give for granted most of the times that when we are into an engagement, it's because our army, in the first place, is able to stand on her feet. And the point is that if you don't, say that bigger engagements are exactly connected with areas that actually favor, also from the point of view of terrain, that same those same type of armies, right? You don't have 30,000 men having to storm a stinky castle entrenched in the mountains, right? You will send other troops for that, lesser ones, because also those castles are, generally speaking, smaller, because they are not the big ones controlling the flatlands, that gain resources, and around which, in fact, most battles in medieval warfare would revolve around, because they were triggered effectively by one large army besieging a castle and then another army coming to relief, and that was pretty much standard, right? For example, Shadiversity says this, it can happen. Well, it was basically like 90% of medieval battles happening like that, so it was just normal, expected, and medieval logistics and military organization in general were radically advanced, right? They were extremely advanced. Medieval armies, very often, you just think about the preeminence of cavalry and the general improvement also metallurgy, the heaviness of equipment by a certain standard, at least from a certain type onwards, etc., required a great organization that by standard, by default, if that 30,000 army left, was already there, right? So the larger the army, the less likely it is in the first place that it can't get somewhere where its supply lines can be cut, right? Because it's so big in itself that trying to get past it is incredibly difficult. So of course you can harass it with attacks, ambushes, this kind of skirmishes and so on. But generally speaking, that's not what you say, oh, as Marta will do that, so I will fuck them. It doesn't happen like that, because in warfare, the larger the engagement, the more the odds balance. And so what it gets down to is exactly that big manslaughter of a pitched battle to settle the freaking matter. It's incredibly important to put these things in perspective. And this is not to minimize the importance of skirmishes. I listed, I don't know, in my PhD, it has how many hundreds of skirmishes that even literally said nothing but the number of troops. But it was radically important to understand the entire warfare. And one thing that I would like to point out in that regard is that skirmishes are not, in that sense, let's say, different engagements from the larger ones, right? They're just the same engagements on a smaller scale, right? So you cannot say whether, a clash between 300 knights from one side, 300 from the other is a skirmish or a pitched battle, as opposed to, 30,000 men that, with 3,000 knights, let's say, versus 3,000 knights that clash with the auxiliary infantry and all, like the pitched battle, because that skirmish can be fought and will be fought essentially in the same way the same pitched battles are fought very often, right? And so, generally speaking, in medieval warfare, you find a broader symmetry. Like, until the guys from the steppe come in and remain at the outskirts in the first place, you don't really have a different type of warfare, right? The differences are shades of some kind, and not really, that do not really affect the core of tactics and strategy, for how also they are generally and universally played, right? So this is incredibly important. One thing that the author of the video says at some point is something along the pattern that if the battle is long, you need more supplies. Well, he makes the point also that battles could fight over days, which is true, but telling the truth, the main engagements really lasted from few hours to maybe to several hours, right? So a day overall. And even though, again, those preliminary clashes were very important and are very overlooked, and that they mostly have a strategic function. It is to, in fact, channel that battle, as Shadiversity points out, in a specific place, and trying to to force the enemy in a disadvantageous position, etc. But as we were saying before, again, if you give battle in those conditions, you will have just a few hours to get it over with. And so how much you have supplies at that given moment doesn't really make any difference, right? The importance is how much at least you have eaten in the previous days, if you were starving to death. And again, the larger the army, the least likely this is. Because again, the same deterrence of the army does not provide the enemy with the opportunity to really dramatically cut off this entire monster from the ways that he controls in that moment, and that trying to harass would put your own force in actually a condition of inferiority compared to the one of frontal clash that actually would maximize your own chances to take that army out. This is, again, radically important. I have a playlist dedicated to the Kriege, and this is military theory, and it's, again, very important. This applies to any era. It's not just medieval times, and medieval times are, in this sense, often credited as the time. Shadiversity doesn't say this. This is important because many people instead make the same mistake that in medieval warfare, pitched battles were rare. Well, in relative terms, they weren't rare at all, right? Actually, were pretty frequent. And of course, the smaller engagements were much more numerous, but in this sense, they're just the pitched battles may be rare in comparison to them, but they're not a rare eventuality in the normal political landscape of a medieval reality. Of course, there are certain places in Europe that have more resources. They battle more more often, which is actually the point. And this is a very overlooked, also competitive aspect of medieval warfare that many military historians do not really engage in. But again, there is practically no difference. This is the same in modern warfare, in ancient warfare, right? The fact that ancient historiographers mostly focused on big pitched battles is because they were also pretty concise about those histories in the first place. And of course, we know that there were as many skirmishes as in the Middle Ages, and so the Middle Ages, of course, never existed and do not own, if you actually study the operational history, any kind of special or different nature compared to other times in terms of the art of war and how this was actually carried out in practice. So yeah, this is an important aspect. He also points out that scouting, of course, has a major relevance in medieval warfare. And while this is true in every situation, it is still valid what I was saying before regarding the fact that the bigger the army, the less options you really have on where to deploy, really. So he makes the case of Hastings, and so the elevated position from which the Anglo-Saxons, surely gained a lot of advantage against the Normans. But if you look at, say, late medieval warfare, again, we can remain in the 13th and 14th century, realize that most armies, mostly, again, in pitched battles, and that's why they're called like that, they negotiated the terrain where to fight, and very often this terrain had to be properly functional to cavalry use, so it was somewhat favorable to both contendants in a way. Of course, there was always some terrain is never flat or devoid of. It's really Shadiversity is right in insisting on the cruciality of terrain, because it is really a protagonist of the battle. But at the same time, you realize again that the larger the army and the more normal the battlefield will be, right? You need enough space to maneuver. And this is incredibly important because the battles that we study are actually the result of strategic situations in which both sides agreed to fight in the first place, right? So this was, again, often negotiated at the time, and again, very often the battlefields resemble like some tournament fields, were long and somewhat narrow to channel this in this also kind of chivalric, loyal way the various battle lines one against the other, except they would use some concealed reserves to attack from the side. And we will talk about this because Shadiversity doesn't talk about it, but it's also a radically important factor, and mostly associated with late medieval warfare, but that probably was there since ever, because again, it's also a pretty standard packed art of war know-how. So if you do not have a specific advantage to fight, the point is that you will not fight, or you will just find a terrain that will try to compensate that disadvantage, which basically also means for the defender to leave the initiative to the enemy, which is actually a declaration of strategic weakness, right? As opposed, because the attacker is the stronger side, right? Is the one that can more and will do if the possibility is there. That's why, as von Clausewitz explains, attack is the weak form of war, but with a positive aim, because consume more resources doing it, and so you have some important penalty, if you want, in a broader sense, in a relative sense, because again, you could still have the advantage, but the negative aim because the positive aim because you are actively, in fact, seeking to achieve a result, and conversely, defense is the stronger form of war because it does provide with that kind of advantage in a way, but with the negative aim, because by leaving the initiative to the enemy, you're just basically making him capitalize upon your idleness. And of course, again, there are so many other factors that can interplay there. War is just a continuation of politics with other means. So whatever the reason wars are fought, it's always political, right? Eventually, they take the military form strategically or tactically, but politics always control the whole thing at every given time. You can't stop the operations from a moment to another. Back home, that's the order. But again, I would like to stress the lack of options that the larger armies really have, even on choosing a terrain, right? And so in getting into the war in the first place, if this presented with some particular disadvantages for which it wouldn't be worth to even fight, right? So this is the extreme asymptotic kind of pattern spectrum that we should maintain in our understanding of warfare. Then it starts to think about missile troops. He says that Crécy at Azincourt, missile troops were profoundly effective against cavalry, but due to terrain type of circumstance and the approach that heavy cavalry was taking. So the point we were making before about combined arms is the same here. Crécy and Azincourt weren't won by the English because of their missile troops, or better, missile troops were necessary for that combined arms tactics, but not less than, the same French army worked like with its own combined tactics. And the archers definitely didn't make the thing. Archers alone do not stop cavalry in any useful manner. They need to be supported by infantrymen or other cavalry. It was actually more the habit, as you know, in medieval warfare. There, the English had developed this particular doctrine, as you know, that was extremely successful, but that was a combined arms operation in which the decisive element were the men-at-arms, right? Or at least the predominant element were the men-at-arms, and the decisivity of the battle, right, was made by the combined arms. Well, let's say had the same men-at-arms having to take out their own archers, the archers would be butchered immediately, right? So equally, archers did not stop French cavalry. This is not the point. We talked extensively about this. It's the combined arms tactics of whatever heavy cavalry or infantry plus missile troops that make the thing. Any other army in Europe worked in the same way, right? I made extensive videos about the same French warfare, same English warfare, but this is particularly evident everywhere, right? You rarely have, it's only basically at the beginning of the 14th century, after a couple of centuries of probably decisivity of cavalry on the fields, some infantry-only armies that basically last until the mid-14th century. Then you need essentially the Swiss to restart other that had already been protagonists of this, but changed significantly their military system in ways that were very different also from their own of the 14th century in the 15th to defeat cavalry once again. And those battles have been a bit overestimated in terms of strictly military legacy, because aside from the English, again, that were an exception, that were a monarchic one, by the way, differently mostly from the others, except maybe for Scotland, because that's what mostly had. Were feudal monarchy, but a bit less feudal than the average, and than England in particular. So they had kind of less cavalry than infantry. But if you look at the great Flemish victory of Courtrai, you see that the rest of late medieval Flemish warfare actually is a constant series of defeats at the hands of a French chivalric culture that was the same one defeated at the Battle of the Golden Spurs, and what the Flemish had just infantry per se, and also unprofessional one. It was not really effective as much as it had been before, because most of warfare is actually about moral forces, which is the other kind of cornerstone of the entire warfare in history. It's not even important what you have in your hands as much as you want to kill the person in front of you. And believe me that, because there are no technologistic prejudices, but in Shadiversity's video, but this thing of the archers managing to cut down cavalry in those battles where cavalry was heavy, by the way, it doesn't exist. Like, light infantry does not do it, and it did not happen, right? Which doesn't mean that an archer cannot take down a single cavalryman, but what really matters is what it's able to do on a bigger scale. And bogging cavalry down when still this manages to charge repeatedly, by the way, and not breaking through infantry. It's mostly about the infantry, right? The archers are kind of an accompanying element, if you want. So I fear that the video overstates a little bit the archers' capacity. By the way, crossbowmen, I think, are not even named in this video. So again, yes, I do believe there is some kind of broader British bias in the thing. And in fact, at a point, the author says if the cavalry had attacked the archers from the flank or unaware, they would have wiped out the floor with those archers. This is the thing. Well, the point is that heavy cavalry is not wasted in attacking light infantry, right? Heavy cavalry is sent to smash against heavy infantry or against other heavy cavalry, and that's it, right? You don't just send it against light infantry, because light infantry is not able to take out cavalry alone. That's the point. And saying, well, if cavalry had attacked the archers from the flank or unaware, is saying, first of all, unaware means these men are not ready for battle, so it's not even just a battle. Practically, it's just a slaughter. And that's exactly what everybody would like to do with the enemy, except battles are fought because normally, in a strategic sense, this option is not there. Of course, there is, but very often in smaller engagements, and I don't know of any big army in this broader medieval warfare was taken out just because we're caught unaware, right? Unless we're talking properly about a broader ambush or some, again, lack of deployment altogether. And in any case, heavy cavalry is hardly ever wasted, because that's what it means against, again, anything light, including other cavalry. I will see it better with the Mongolian example there. But the point also of attacking from the flank, which is the only time that this tactics is named in the video, is actually a much more crucial topic that I'm incidentally just also working and writing on right now. That first of all was carried out by essentially pocket units of cavalry, just a few of them. Very often they were accompanied actually by the same infantry on the enemy rear or flank, and very often this was properly the battle line, is say the cavalry line. Look at Markfeld, look at Talyakots. I mean, these are the some of the largest and most important, not just examples of this tactics, but of battles in the first place in medieval Europe. And the reason was, of course, that these reserves were often concealed, because you do not go in battle against an enemy that, first of all, deploys so eccentrically. First of all, it would have been a disadvantage for them too, because that thing of deploying the battle lines in depth would have been fucked up for them. And so it would have been somewhat relatively exposed, this detached contingent, and gone against the principle of mass. And so that's why it was not done. Everything has a specifically logical reason. Because otherwise, I'm a smart guy, use a concealed reserve. You may not even find the right time to attack. That we have information of this. There were battles in which both sides had concealed reserve. Again, 50, 60 men against battle lines that were kind of in the hundreds of even in the thousands sometimes of knights in the largest engagements. And again, a heavy cavalry would have never kind of attacked light infantry during a flank attack. What for? Right? Those are troops that you can simply attack in many other ways with other light infantry or cavalry or whatever. Right? And these normally did happen, because most medieval armies, I presume, at least, this is a bit obscure by historiography, but they normally had some infantry on the sides on a regular basis, and the obvious point was that they were symmetric to the enemy wings on the other side, so they took each other out, and if they managed to do so, they would fall on the enemy cavalry flank that was exposed at that point, and they would have gradually worn out the line until this broke, right? And that's how it normally happened. Or with this important flank attacks for concealed parties that would cut in half the line. There are beautiful passages about this as well. But you do not use heavy cavalry that you have concealed and that you have succeeded to put the enemy in that dreadful condition of inferiority with, to attack some stinky archers that, in comparison with the heavy unit, are worthless in the economy of the battle. The only way cavalry could do such a thing was against infantry wings, which I found instead, given that infantry wings in that sense are heavy infantry, and even if they cannot resist cavalry, still they're heavy infantry because they're capable of taking over the other kind of lighter troops, and that's why you have always that kind of stopping force, and the archers are just essentially an auxiliary force that comforts them. But again, archers do not take out infantry alone, heavy infantry alone. They do not make it. This is also another thing that does not exist in warfare. This is true in Napoleonic warfare as much as true is in medieval warfare, in ancient warfare, in any, because that's exactly what the difference between heavy and light really means. And it's only combined arms that make the thing happen. It's very often, in the most military developed context, you have very often this infantry wings taken out by the joint attack of themselves against each other, plus the archers shooting from mostly the rear, and flank attacks even from this cavalry unit, so that the infantry wing would collapse, and again the opposing one would be able to fall again on the enemy, the uncovered enemy flank. So the reason why Shadiversity makes this example, in my opinion, is misleading. And I say it again because it may give the impression again that this magic archers could take out cavalry they were so dangerous, cavalry needed to charge. This didn't happen. It never happened, especially in any warfare. You always need a shock force, and archers are not, because they are light infantry. And it can generate again the further lack of attention towards, especially battles like the English tactics of the 100 Years' War, that were a radical and beautiful success of combined arms tactics, and that just putting the emphasis so much on the archers doesn't lead anywhere. Considering also that archers were disproportionately more numerous than the heavy infantry, so even just in qualitative terms, you can understand how even their collective use, that was again not sufficient to take out the heavies, was individually also, pretty meager, right? I also made a video recently regarding longbows, crossbows, this kind of things. Not in the usual way. Was just asked, whether we can, draw any positive information from replicas and tests. Shadiversity, just at a point says, I tested bows, and so I immediately understand that, I don't know if you know the character. You will. You can't check that out, but you immediately get that sense of, okay, that it's that background, that background that Sabot has developed. In fact, that's what's the channel so successful. Within that kind of, say, I don't know now the specifics, but I mean, at least experimental archaeology, some sort of reenactment, and this broader medieval enthusiasm. But even as a medievalist, I come from a very different background, and generally speaking, I can't spot this bias much more often than not, unfortunately. And there is in fact one passage of the video in which he even says, the Mongolian archers were able to destroy the Polish knights, read the German and Polish knights actually, Lenitsa, and also, well, in other engagements, but and through many engagements, he says, as they were attracted by light cavalry and destroyed by light cavalry. And this point was made in a broader passage in which he was arguing that fundamentally light cavalry is able to lure the enemy and in a way that would essentially break his own line, and so he would be able eventually to strike against this broken enemy and destroy it. Right, so this also is a broader misconception, because light infantry, for the same reasons we said before, does not the thing alone, right? And if somebody knows that you can be taken out in detail if you abandon the formation, even by, let's say, qualitatively inferior, but say numerically superior forces, you will just not do it, right? And say medieval fighters knew these things, right? It's not that they met even for the first time the Mongols and they said, well, okay, whatever they deploy, like, we've never seen how they fight, let's just roll the dice and see. No, it didn't happen like that. They were pretty much aware of every single damn capacity that certain types of troops, for just the way they were equipped, they were arrayed, whatever, could do, right? And the point of battles like Lenitsa and others it's not the fact that light cavalry wins or that is able to magically draw an opponent somewhere to just crush him as light cavalry, because in here that's what he actually meant. Also, he didn't mention heavy cavalry in the process, but actually to drive him against what the enemy knew was present, that is heavy cavalry. The Mongols had heavy cavalry, it's just light cavalry. And while it is true that steppe warfare normally had kind of, a narrower, quantitatively, but also superior or qualitatively elite, in fact, of heavies over the majority of light cavalry, still those swarms of light cavalry of the Mongols would have never defeated alone a Western heavy cavalry charge, right? And that's the same reason why in battle this light cavalry wouldn't engage them frontally, because they would have ended up destroyed. And the concept is not much, in fact, the paper, scissors, stone, is the fact that if you have that tactical superiority that even light cavalry in some circumstances against the heavy one could have, especially if it's, again, for example, charged from the flank or things like these, or maybe it just outnumbers them, you would just confer you the initiative to attack. So declaring that your cavalry needs to retreat in order to, because it cannot engage against heavy cavalry, surprise, surprise, because again, heavy cavalry is superior to it in absolute terms, right? And the point of that cavalry charge was to break through what was in fact the Mongol center that was refused until it led in the depths of that formation against the Mongolian heavy cavalry that had to pin the Western cavalry down. And I just made a couple of months ago a video about how the Western sources were surprised by the robustness of the Mongolian armor that still, however, had some problems on the longer run. It was showed, and the Western system actually seemed to have been superior by some degree on the longer run. Also, because simply the Mongols fragmented, and so again, it's always a political issue. It's not much what they could put on the field in a military formula. It's what they have. Again, mostly their moral strength, and then also what their tactics entail. But the point that I was making is that only at that point the light cavalry would have, as an auxilium, fundamentally, fell on the heavier cavalry. Had it done it, by the way, because there were other troops, also infantry from the German-Polish side, and taken it from the side and overwhelmed it, annihilated it, after having worn it out with arrows along the way and so on. So it was still a combined armed tactics, and it was no guarantee of victory in absolute terms, right? If you had measured, Mongol army and the German-Polish army in Letnica, you would have found that they were probably well balanced in the odds, and that's the reason why they fought. And even though, again, it's just like the English victories of the 100 Years' War, etc., you do realize that there is something that is superior in the broader military culture, at least in the specifics of that doctrine, that especially in those armies that can afford to perform it, which is the actual point, and that has most to do with professionalism, and not much with which tactics they actually use or array they use, you can realize that they still were quite balanced. Because again, in warfare, people do not fight if they see a dramatic disadvantage for which they know they're going to be butchered. So if the French charged into the English lines, if the Polish knights charged in the Mongolian lines, it's not because there were a bunch of imbeciles that just had screwed up the tactic, and they just were, for some culturalistic obsession, wanting to fight like that, right? The issue is extremely more complicated, and I also partly illustrated it in a recent video made about the French military organization of the 100 Years' War. We will talk more about this. I have in the oven a video about the Battle of Poitiers, finally after years. This entire thing of the lighter element to have a shot against the heavier one is actually by definition wrong, right? And the video, in my opinion, is misleading, and it can really cause a broader misunderstanding, because it's a sort of relativistic point, right? It's not assessing the actual dimensions of the various arms, right, in forces, on medieval battlefields, but beyond, right? So the terrain also is a crucial factor. Shadiversity stresses this dramatically, but it's not, again, of course, the only factor. And so I say this just because he points at that you may have so much advantage, but the terrain can change the thing. Well, yes, but again, it's the same thing we were saying before. If the enemy is deployed on a dramatically advantageous terrain, well, that evenly balances the thing also for the attacker in that sense, and the attacker is aware of that, and he is still generally superior, because if the defender was superior, would be the one to pass on the attack and to have the initiative, and he doesn't, right? So of course he will balance things out using any factor possible. But I must say that terrain per se, this is a broader conceptual point, is very often not enough for us to say from the sources, even knowing the actual battlefields and so on, how effective that really was. Like in the broader cauldron of factors that played in that battle that are not reconstructible in a moral and scientific sense. We do not have the capacity to replicate mathematically or scientifically or anything what actually happened in those battles, especially we can't in the first place. Like, we don't have simulators, even in contemporary era, that actually are able to predict things as they will happen. Warfare is the furthest realm from that possible, but also we have to do it through medieval sources. And I've been reading a lot of medieval sources, aside from, let's say, dramatic engagements in which the enemies made a specific mistakes, and this often happen in smaller ones, right? So again, the thing we said for the larger armies in the first place, that will be still that you can maneuver just in some operational theaters and not others, right? Just think about Mongol armies, hundreds of thousands of horses. Logistically, you just can't follow certain ballets because in certain seasons, because your army cannot afford to survive anywhere else, right? So you will find in the smaller engagements this kind of limitations, and maybe the troops are caught in an ambush, as it mostly happens, but they cannot deploy fully, and so they lost their combined arms potential, and so that happens. But generally speaking, in major battles, terrain is useful, very useful, but is hardly, like, we don't have the quantitative measure how much that influence overall. I mean, let's assume it made a very big impact, a 10% of the outcome. It's still 10%. It's very far from 50%. There is nothing that reaches that 50% in our knowledge. And if it also, because it would have been much more evident to them in the first place, and that would have been, a very good, let's say, reason not to fight, because the odds are balanced towards 50%. If you have something that takes that entirely out, means that you cannot fight. You will have to retreat. And that's how it basically gets down to. Now, another thing he talks about is siege machinery on battlefields. He says clearly Hollywood stopped doing it. That is appreciated in a way. He makes a couple of examples that I have not watched. That is, I think, Game of Thrones and Mulan. I don't know what he's talking about really, but I can imagine that's given the general standard. I mean, to me, Disney is dead ever since the Lion King. Specifically, as a kid, I preferred all the older ones, even though I was just born a few years before. But about Game of Thrones, I can imagine the sheer amount of bullshit that can be represented. But don't think that Vikings or even Outlaw King are anything better. I mean, the scene of what would be allegedly Bagnock burning in the Outlaw King is one of the single most radically incompetent, idiotic, and culturally literate cavalry charge than anybody can even conceive. But everybody says, "Oh my God!" I remember. I think it was Shadiversity that was talking about Outlaw King, who came out. He hadn't seen it. Says, there are little things that maybe do not fit. Yes, what the fuck, cavalry charge of tens of rows of cavalrymen pouring like shit into something that is not even a battle line. Something atrociously ridiculous that completely denies any tactical competence of expertise for anyone that even thought that in the first place. But that's why I say to sing against reenactment, etc. I remember Shadiversity is saying, the clothes are fantastic, the costumes are perfect. There is something here and there, maybe in the story or in the thing, in the tactic. Yeah, it's just like, that's the exact type of mentality that ruins the thing, in my opinion. I must be very, very blunt here. What people wear, let's leave aside from the fact that, a movie is a movie. And what you should appreciate is the artistic value of it. And I think that these Netflix series are all crap. I don't care if they talk about medieval warfare, whatever, if they get the customs right. Customs, weapons even, are the single least important or relevant thing in everything, in warfare specifically. And if I watch something like that, I don't want, which is still loaded in the typical Hollywood kind of bullshit. I don't want to be, let's say, to have it promoted to me, especially if I'm an incompetent person, to pretend that that's accurate when it's a pile of garbage, right? And I truly mean it with all my heart about especially that. And again, for the money that they spent, they could have done a much better movie. Like make it to me, like a much better series, whatever that was. I just watched that unfortunate battle scene. But just for saying that, this guy makes a video that gets, has millions of views, many others that are very successful, and people follow him, well, not realizing that the standard there is not met, and there's more of this. In any case, regarding siege warfare, and so I exploded finally, but the siege warfare, because I remember that thing, Shadiversity, and I don't know, I don't want to dramatize things, but it gets down to that at the end of the day. And regarding siege engines in pitched battles, he says, okay, there actually were. He makes accurately the point of Battle of Crécy. Famously enough, the English used a bombard, one of the early types, and medieval warfare was already there. There were already battles in which probably had been used. Just that was a big one, and so as it mostly happens, we know about that because it's better documented than the others, right? And it's meaningful that it was used in a pitched battle, and the reason being, as he enters in the matter, that he says, this any type of artillery, because it is called artillery even before firearms came in, was used just in sieges. Well, the point is that most battles, as we've seen in medieval times, were essentially framed in an operational theater where the army stormed some castle, right? There was not such a separation like, we go out there for camping just to meet a random army and nothing. No, you would have in the meanwhile it would be useful to take out castles, securing positions, because by, the time you have gathered so many forces, what's the point of just, crossing on a place, on a war zone, and not securing these positions, siege engines were present all the time in these armies. And because Shadiversity says, I've never seen a trebuchet in a pitched battle, and tell me if you know of any. I personally don't know of any either, but I do know of other types of, in fact, of artillery, including ballistas, for example, still in the full 13th, 14th century. There's plenty of evidence of that. Sometimes the sources are relatively generic. They say things like tormenta, for example, in Latin, or but you realize, I also studied siege warfare extensively, and the first thing you notice there is, of course, even though our kind of general imagination is captivated by the trebuchet, which is very big and dramatic, and it was actually mounted in different pieces, some of which were built on the spot. The beams were brought from, some depot sometimes. But next to those big ones, there were also somewhat unique. They were nicknamed because they were unique pieces, and of course, in artisanal world, you had at least, like for one trebuchet, you had, say, like this, out of 10 siege, properly, I'm talking about projectiles, throwers. And this is even in sieges, because it said there were 30 pieces, and we don't know which one they were, because the dictionary is also, the term is generic, etc. But you realize that just like for the castles, etc., for the big ones, you had lots of other small ones that were also pretty handy types. I mean, think about even in firearms later, it was pretty much the same thing. I mean, the musket was born out of actually mobile artillery type. This is often forgotten. The same goes for crossbows. Some crossbows that were operated by individuals on the battlefield were pretty larger than others, and some of them would be, in fact, of the type of mobile size that would be used in the same battles in open field. And I did find several, examples of this. I give it. It's rare, right? It's not normal, but the fact is, again, that from these battles we know relatively few, especially about the details, right? What's really the sources were interested in, especially when they actually properly understand the battle, was basically the battle lines interaction. And we're talking about, we'll see it later, not about small things. Said, this battle was won because this little thing was changed, which is a point Shadiversity really makes. No, like, battles are won, generally speaking, by the bigger thing, right? The fact that the tip of the iceberg sometimes is more visible, it accounts for 1%, and you say, the battle was won for this because here the sources said that. Doesn't count the other 49% that you need to reach that 50% plus, actually 50%, because you need 50% plus 1 to be decisive. And so you realize that the tip of the iceberg is floating, in fact, on a much larger base that is submerged, but actually not really, because it's actually the tip of the iceberg very often is not noted because nobody gives a shit about it, and it's actually the forces and the broader battle lines interaction that was pretty much always similar, right? Every battle was different, but the dynamics were pretty much the same. So that's what they cared about, and realized that the little factor surely makes the thing as in the sum of others, but in that sense it's not even manageable, and it's not even predictable. And fundamentally what you should control is this big masses of men, making them cooperate collectively, and leading the thing in a way that also preparing thing. And most of, especially the largest battle, there wasn't really any other way to practically fight them, right? And again, this should be properly stressed, that yes, you can change many little things, but the core logic of deploying the battle lines in that order, in that depth, etc., is pretty much dictated by also what you generally speaking know about the opponent. And very often we don't know what the practical knowledge was mostly orally transmitted in medieval warfare really was, because they didn't write treatises, and it's not before the 18th century fundamentally that anybody also fulfills really, you have a treaty that is actually telling you what happens on the battlefield, and it's not just some kind of subjective opinion of the same. So the only way to understand that knowledge is to study as many battles as you can, and so you, at that point, you will realize that kind of different, that difference that it may seem to you at the beginning to be there between one battle and another actually derives from the fact that you have not studied enough battles, because when you do, they all kind of start becoming very similar, and you kind of give less importance to the detail because you understand what the bigger point of the thing really is, and that's where the art of war really substantiates itself up, right? And gives you the capacity of adapting to the contingental context, but still realizing that it's not the tiny thing that necessarily made it, right? But it's the what could afford to make it happen that made it. And of course, yes, accidents can ruin the whole thing. I mean, if you take like an arrow in the eye, aside from the Harold Godwinson, or the same Harold Ardrada, that fatal 1066, which is a bit of a topos, literally speaking, the revenge of God, and we all know this. But yes, this could be meaningful, but very often also when these things happen, maybe the armies of the killed commander even won anyway, right? So again, we from a Clausewitzian perspective, when we reconstruct these things historically, we have to accept that unless we are not sure about the actual quantities that interplay between causes and consequences, we cannot properly say, this element effectively was decisive. Because even of 5 things that we know about that battle, we don't know other 15 that may have been as relevant, or that's just the were given for granted by those who wrote them, which is actually what is based on reality. And so the importance of historical research in this sense is crucial, because it shows you that it's not just the randomness of it, it's also all the enormous work behind it. And of course, I think Shadiversity perfectly gets this. It's just that maybe this was the chance to talk about it more openly if he hasn't done it yet. He also makes the point again that terrain is crucial, and so he makes an example at some point. He says, look, if you send one guy against 5, even if you have 5 yourself, but you have to enter like a narrow path, and so when just one guy enters one at a time, you have a dramatic advantage because you will defeat him in detail. Yes, it's like you say, the Thermopylae or whatever. But even in that case, as we were saying before, the whole thing depends on how much the strategic pressure really is, right? How much of course, the logistical needs. Think about, again, stopping an entire army on a place that is not also so advantageous, because again, it's a difficult terrain, and difficult terrains mostly are in strategically less relevant places, right? So these are also, frankly, rare eventualities, because in medieval warfare, again, the least important, like in any warfare, the least important engagement, the more likely these things are going to happen. So in the bigger ones, these things do not happen. There's mostly pitched battles in open field, and that's it. And terrain is very important. Of course, anyone would deploy on a higher ground if possible, and so on. This happens all the time, but it's not the thing, and very often, as we were saying before, if it is, just to nullify such possibility of winning, because you can simply bottle up the enemy in a way that he cannot effectively maneuver. It's more like, why would the enemy have to attack? Or he could be that pressured to do it, but it's still obvious that he will dare doing it because he thinks that's worth the risk, which generally speaking is well assessed, and that's why we mostly don't understand battles like Crécy or Azincourt, even assuming we understand them, which very often also from a historiographical point of view we don't so clearly. We don't have to think that a medieval battle is we know exactly why what happened in the first place, not even why what happened, but like, can we even know, right? And very often accounts are very divergent, to the point that we can draw parallel battles that happen, let's say, and that evidently also are, some can rule some out because they're less likely, etc. But we don't have the certainty, and sometimes we don't have it by a significant margin, so that you can always have a scrapple in history, because nobody really eventually knows perfectly what happened. And not even the people who fought in it knew perfectly what happened. This is the point. But military logic helps in that work. So yes, terrain is so important, but of course, as he points out with Hastings correctly, so he's perfectly aware of that, things can go very differently depending on the outcome, right? So surely a plus for that to Shadiversity. We come back on the thing he said about the unit formation depth or width, right? As we were saying before, he insists with this thing of, for the sake of example, say doubling, as he does, the depth of the formation. And he, again, the whole concept is correct, except the idea of the substitution from the rare ranks, which is somewhat, in part it's obvious because he says this opens up a problem with how that happened. At some point he seems to be talking, I should recheck the video, but I don't want to say wrong things, but the mutatio, for example, type of Roman tactics, because he literally says, this idea of doubling, of having many troops in the rear that could substitute the front ones, he talks literally in the way, somebody killed or wounded in the front will be substituted by someone else in the rear, and going on the longer the file is. This is not really how it worked. I mean, the depth of the line in the Roman example that he makes, that is actually, again, universal, because even in medieval armies they did that. It's not a Roman thing. It's how just developing in depth in multiple lines. By the way, the Romans didn't always do that either, right? They on the contrary, the moment in which they evolved in their professional kind of direction of the army, mostly if you look at the battles, they felt sometimes they're just very wide and thin lines, and they just took each other out on the flanks, and that also was pretty similar to other people's tactics. So again, that depended even on things that we practically don't know, because it's not that we have, a Roman treaty written by a centurion who told us how things really happened, or even by a general that really told us, I did this and that. We have just historians reporting that. Some come from later times, and so it's very complicated. I made lots of videos about ancient warfare as well. You can't check the thing out. But again, the point that Shadiversity here does not seem to get is that there are different battle lines, and the substitution happens not in the way, say, how much some sections, or say that line is worn out during combat, so you can integrate it with people from the rear. Again, one line fought, was defeated, and then another one came in the fight, right? And mostly, yes, the first line could retreat behind the others when it was broken, because it was in an open order, could pass even within the gaps of the posterior battle lines. Again, these were separated by hundreds of meters, right? And thus also maybe trying to form up a reserve in the very bottom of the line, but we don't really find this. Like in medieval battles, I haven't found, like, once a line is spent, right, it's spent for the day, because it's exhausted psychophysically. So you can maybe, as long as the entire army still holds in the rear, you can maybe group them with some other forces, if some troops, some elements make it, but the power of the fresh battle line can never be represented by any concrete level for that battle. And that's why reserves are so crucial, and that's why indeed this in-depth formation is so relevant, but not because you just have a very deep block of troops, and so you can say you can't simply replenish the first lines from the rear, because again, as we were saying before, the distribution of the men within the unit is functional to essentially the engagement of the first ranks, right? Also, medieval battles, as we know, the posterior ranks were just made up of people that sometimes were not even armed, right? They had to make mass because psychologically they were the field aides, attendants. They psychologically intimidated the enemy, that they couldn't see how armed they really were, but they see there were other people. And there is also, again, a psychological interaction between people within the unit, saying when they're grouped, etc. but the combat functionality of a unit is fundamentally revolving around the integrity of the first lines. Yes, in medieval times, when you have dramatic cavalry charges, you have some of these men that are able to charge into the pikemen and breaking them, because pikes were used since prehistory, and it's completely false. Shadiversity doesn't say this, so it's not an issue here. But many people think about that cavalry didn't charge into pikemen. They did it literally all the time, right? Because that's how cavalry is to be engaged. Heavy cavalry, shock cavalry, just straight impacts the enemy lines, and it's channeled also in the front line, in the center, just to do that, right? And very often, since they are the decisive arm, it's because they can simply overwhelm the infantry, even if they're equipped with pikes. Because pikes are not held by themselves, do not do the job by themselves, but held by people who are capable of resisting the most traumatically violent and permanent shock of a cavalry charge, which is, it's not less traumatic than a modern shelling, right? It's one of the single worst things that you can even imagine. We have modern soldiers that witnessed even mock cavalry charges during for example, when they shot the Waterloo movie in the 70s, that literally couldn't hold the line, even knowing that it was a fake cavalry charge. You don't really want to know what a cavalry charge really is. So the point I'm making is that, again, the depth of the formation there is of relative use, because yes, you can, as a point, thicken the line, thinking that the enemy could break into it. And so the more troops you have from the rear, you also can fall on it. But at the same time, the moral resistance of the unit revolves around the top guys that can stop that cavalry charge. I mean, the fact that a cavalry charge manages to break through the first lines, it's already disaster, right? It's an incredibly critical and dangerous situation. It is true, for example, as at Courtrai, that you can have reserves, even of infantry pouring in a line that is broken. But at that point, because the line very often is broken, because a section of the entire line has melted away, because once you melt the first ranks, also the posterior ones do not have the moral strength to hold, because the entire functionality of that formation is, again, those guys stopping the cavalry in the first ranks with pikes, remaining solid enough to avoid even cavalry charging, because cavalry, while charging straight against these formations, takes its time, right? For example, circle around the enemy formation. If it was a Schiltern, for example, a circular one sometimes does happen. And to find the right spot where to charge were the better ones. And incidentally, within the Schiltern, you had the rabble behind the actual heavy pikemen that was moving in parallel to the enemy cavalry from the other side to kind of make mass to be that additional extra, to hoping to hold an eventual breakthrough against an eventual breakthrough, but they weren't truly the decisive element in that regard. And while it is true that cavalry is never as vulnerable as at the end of the charge, it's also true that a too deep formation, as Shadiversity points out, also essentially takes away troops from the flanks, where could, for example, attack cavalry while it's clashing against an infantry formation with multiple charges and so on, or against cavalry. And this, as we've seen, did happen with the wings closing on it, and thus, precluding yourself that kind of option. The point here is that we can't say, okay, the glass is half full and half empty, but the point is that in medieval warfare, generally speaking, there was, and also in others, there was a standard of some depth that was fundamentally maintained. As far as I've seen, we're probably something around 8 ranks deep, right? And that would have been enough, really, because there is no point there if your infantry is not strong enough to resist in 8 ranks deep a cavalry charge. It's not by adding other ranks that formation will feel more compact. On the contrary, we'll say we're so shitty that we need so many ranks to hold, and it means just even from the guys in the front, it's that we're done for. And that happens only if you know actually that you have that weakness. And so that enormous depth actually is not really witnessed until very late in time, also because these troops have to be collectively trained to maintain such a larger formation. And that until the late Middle Ages, those such large formations, starting with only with the Swiss, were in fact not capable of performing such, to be so cohesive, collectively speaking, to even have that function, which was one of the reasons why infantry was just rarely and mostly concentrated in some regions of Europe for some decade in the early 14th century, even capable, deployed in the front against cavalry. And very often just as a desperate measure, because it was not necessarily that to win it all, of course, as Shadiversity also points out. It's always the broader tactics, but in a way these were much more primitive, because they were based not really on a real combined arms. One, just practically the English with the men-at-arms and the longbowmen do this, but if you look at the Scots, for example, or the Flemish, they just use infantry. They had cavalry a little bit, but fundamentally they decided to take the field mostly with these infantry formations holding. And that was not a positive thing. Like more developed countries that had, let's say, in a professional, statal sense, not necessarily they were poorer or richer. I mean, Flanders used infantry-only armies at that point, even if they were the richest, among the richest peoples in Europe, whereas Scotland was fundamentally a depressed country. So this is also how one cannot generalize, of course, agreeing with Shadiversity. But they wouldn't do something so crazy like, you have cavalry, you don't use it. Of course, the problem is political. It's social, because, again, in Scotland, there was less surplus for an effective amount of heavy cavalry compared to the English. In the Flemish fought on foot because they were bourgeois that had made essentially a revolution against the nobility that, however, still commanded them in small numbers in those same battles. And these were men that preferably always fought on horseback, even the same actual persons that when they fought in other contexts and abroad, they fought only on horseback. So that's how contingential certain things really are. And in fact, as we were saying before, even in these battles where infantry had a great relevance, you hardly even ever find the measure, how deep these formations really were. Because generally speaking, there was a good enough number that would do for the thing, and important also was, of course, the width of the formation at some levels. And the sources do not care, because even though that was an important factor, it would have accounted for how much? A 2, a 3, a 4%? It helped, but it was not, or it was just obviously to employ, also because they had maybe enough troops, like it happened, like there was some phalanxes that were just deployed in some narrow, again, terrain, so that would facilitate the task, again. But this doesn't mean, for example, that cavalry was powerless, or just the odds were just decided in favor of one another. In fact, in most of the French defeats in that instance, for example, at Courtrai, etc., you realize that they had actually broken the line. At Courtrai, the French broke the Flemish line. It was just that small reserve from the rear that managed to in that section that had collapsed, again, not while there is a formation is still intact, you send many in. And this is what Shadiversity seems to be saying, that doesn't happen, right? You need properly another unit that can fit that broader thing. Because if you don't do it orderly, also, you lose great part of the entire purpose of why you're doing the thing, which is what the same Shadiversity actually points out when he says, you take out the individual elements in detail. You have to be a compact formation to have enough room for maneuvering and for carrying out an attack collectively, and challenging that force all against the enemy at that point, right? So another bias also in favor of missile troops is, again, cavalry can attack archers if they aren't shot to pieces during the approach, right? This is it's obvious that if he's talking about light cavalry, this is a possibility, of course, but on Western battlefields, you don't find so much light cavalry that is just unanciently attacking, going against archers in the front. So the point is always archers are not normally deployed in the front, at least not in the front, that is the corridor where the heavy troops normally clash against one another. They're best placed on the flanks, which in fact I was very pleased by Shadiversity acknowledging, because this is not so frequent. He makes the example of Chrissy, we'll see it in a while, but it was actually a more widespread tactics that very often is obscured by sources, because they didn't care mostly in the feudal world about the infantrymen, even though those who fought as knights on the field knew perfectly well what the infantry potential really was, and they weren't at all fools charging into them sometimes, even when they got defeated afterwards. Nobody knows how it's going to end in a battle in the first place if it's fought, because if they did, the losing side wouldn't fight. So all the warfare that we see is the product of that possibility, but also still there's no certainty about that. And so, in fact, here I think Shadiversity makes the example for the sake of example. He deploys some archers in a wider line, and cavalry attacks them, and that's where he says, they will be wiped out if they do not shoot cavalry to pieces in the meanwhile. Well, even if we were talking about light cavalry versus archers, frankly, and of course, depending on the circumstance, yes, it can change, but light cavalry in general still has an edge over light infantry, right? That's exactly what you use to chase that. So, again, lots of factors can interplay, the terrain, the numbers, everything, but generally speaking, this thing of even conceiving archers placed as protagonists in the front against some advancing enemy, as we will see, pops up a bit too often in the video, and I think it is misleading because it fundamentally didn't happen, right? These light infantry always had an auxiliary role, right? Never a protagonistic one. Not even, as we were saying before, with the Mongols, because the proof is that they just opened to let the heavy cavalry of the enemy pass through, right? Because they couldn't literally meet them face to face, and they were not just saying, haha, I'm so cunning because I move on the flanks, because they literally were to get out of the way against being massacred in the process. And even in there, it's not a positive thing. Even if your entire tactics revolve in this kind of enveloping maneuver, still that requires an enormous amount of skill to be carried out. And so, just per se, it's not just a positive thing. It's part of a bigger world that always includes heavy troops. The thing is not done by light cavalry infantry alone. So, again, archers in the front, unless it is a skirmishing preliminary phase between, for example, as it happened during, for example, the deploying phases, and getting out of the way as soon as cavalry was approaching, there is no such thing like light troops deploying in the front, right? And especially, I would say, medieval warfare, because until, in fact, cavalry was still inferior to infantry in ancient times, it was easier for, let's say, skirmishers, and had a bigger role, in a way, right? With medieval warfare, we see instead that the center is monopolized by cavalry, and even though we have things like crossbows and longbows that are, in a broader, ever more collectively performing way employed, these are, again, auxiliary troops for the heavier ones. Then he makes a remark about how often would, volleys and precision fire be used in medieval warfare. Of course, he says both were used. The point is that volleys were the more frequent ways of fighting, right? This is not a matter of saying where do you find it, because the collective use of your forces is inherently always superior to the individual one, right? There is no such thing like precision fire most of the time. You just have to land a lot of arrows all at a time on a given enemy to essentially achieve the greatest momentary level of disruption in its lines, even if it is just disorder, right? And that's why, in fact, I repeat it again, light, say, missile troops were not meant to be decisive or even to inflict devastating losses among the enemy. We don't have that. We're mostly used to actually soften up the enemy lines, not to annihilate them or not to cripple them to the point that we're useless and could be taken over by the enemy. Even all the French charges of the 100 Years' War always kind of succeeded. Sometimes it was better not to do it because they thought, that cavalry on certain terrain maybe was useless, or that they were worried, of course, of also the same effect of missile troops, but in combination with, again, the heavy ones. So the effectiveness stands always from the volley side. And if you need precision fire, actually, it doesn't mean that things are good at all, because precision fire is done at short range, and that means that if you are an archer and you need to shoot an enemy, say heavy trooper at close range, means that you're pretty much in trouble. And the reason why you may find yourself like that is, in fact, the combined armed tactics has screwed up in some ways, or there is some small unit tactics that is contingentally putting yourself in, at close range with an enemy, but it's, say, tactically irrelevant most of the times, because these formations all fight like by arms, right? Archers are all from one side, say the wings, and the heavies are all in the center, mounted or dismounted. So the entire point of this all is that, of course, the heavies are going to fight against the heavies and the lights against the lights, and just when they take each other out, they attack the heavies. There is a lot of mythology about the 100 Years' War, as we were saying before, and so we have the impression that the longbows were this terrific weapon that could kill enemies at close range for precision fire. Yes, they had that, specific arrowheads and so on for that. But consider, first of all, that these archers were often used in the aforementioned skirmishes, and sometimes also they were shooting from horseback as, mounted archers. Or in smaller engagements where, yes, you can, let's say, your performance as an individual fighter is more useful than in the bigger engagement, where you have instead to have a collective performance that is superior to the sum of the individual performances of the individual soldiers. And this is the actual point of it all, right? It's not that if you change the equation, it's if you just separate all those guys individually, you make them perform, they do the same thing. No, right? It's the same reason why volleys are used, because you can shoot even the same amount of arrows at a given time, say throughout a given time, all at once or diluted across the same amount of time, and repeating that, and you will realize that even though you shoot the same amount of projectiles, the effect on the enemy formation is much greater if you shoot them all together, because again, it's not important even if they kill people. Again, the missile troops were not able to inflict a decisive man loss to the enemy. But what they were meant to do was disordering them. Be surprised, just like in Napoleonic warfare, artillery was not really meant to kill people. It was meant just to threaten to kill them. It is to say that the ricochet fire was used to make the balls literally bouncing in front of the enemy lines, instead of exploding, it like smashing into them exactly, because the point was to give the time to the soldiers to see that in the front lines, making them freaking out, and as we've seen, the top soldiers of the file are the ones that followed by all the rest of the file, and so disordering the formation. Not killing was considered worthless. Most killing was always done, well, in that age, because of firearms, by musketry fire, but the equivalent in medieval times would be melee, cold steel weapons, right? And that was the first cause of death. And also in, say, linear tactics, in order of importance, is musketry fire, sabers, and cannonballs, just at the end. So it's the same in the Middle Ages, and we'll see how these were actual bath of bloods. And medieval battles, again, were radically bloody. And the percentages tell us continuously. Like, these are easy measures to find, to calculate. I work consistently on them. Losing even just 1/10 of the troops in an engagement, or 2/5, it's enormous. Like, it means it's devastating. And it's incredibly bloody for any time, contemporary, modern, ancient era standards. So I don't understand the point of, medieval battles were not so deadly in combat. Bullshit, right? It is true that most casualties occurred during the retreat, but so it is today. So, frankly, I don't understand the actual point. So, as I was saying, if you are an archer, you find yourself in a pitched battle in front of a heavy enemy that you have to shoot down with precision fire. You're not in a good position, because as light infantry, you are exposed to an enemy that is too close. So unless you are not exactly the guy that stands on the corner of the wings from the internal side next to your own heavies that are fighting against other heavies, and so you're kind of spatially close to the enemy attack, let's say there is nothing positive or practical or something that you should be happy of targeting an enemy at close range like that, right? Even when you have lots of troops amassed, this happens during the Scottish wars, for example, when the English developed their longbow thing, because they just had archers abundantly for some reason. And I made videos about this if you're interested in my medieval, English warfare playlist. And they would use these archers to soften up the enemy infantry. Right? Sometimes there were massacres occurring both in Ireland, in Scotland, etc. But these were kind of not enough to, again, destroy the infantry line. You had to soften them up with archers before cavalry would charge them and break them. So again, the relevance of missile troops in medieval warfare is always subordinated to heavy troops. Right. Another thing that struck me is that while Shadiversity is aware of this aspect, so that of course archers should not be engaged by, you want your archers to be engaged by cavalry on a regular basis at least. He made an example of Crécy where he says, okay, there is the men at arms from the English side, the men at arms in the center, then you have the wings of the archers, and then the enemy approaches. So he says at this point, here, since the archers being on the wings are still basically in the front line, because they're just on the side of the first line of battle of the men-at-arms, in order to avoid the cavalry attacking the archers because they are in the first line, the English infantry would have to advance to intercept the enemy that is attacking. This is nuts, to be blunt. Even here, there's no such thing in the first place. First of all, in that specific situation, when you are, first of all, generally speaking, inferior in number, it's also part of the reason why the English actually dismounted in those circumstances, because it's not that they had to do it forcibly, even though they were kind of habituated by that point since the Scottish wars to do it. The only way to stop a cavalry charge is to be still and exactly where you are. So this thing that in order to protect your own archers as a heavy infantry is trying to in a time where cavalry is decisive, trying to halt it successfully, by the way, as we'll see and as we will know in the first place. When you're being charged by French cavalry, is what do? You move. I mean, that's the best way to be annihilated. You stay still and you maintain your formation. You have whatever, your palisades, your also some pikes there, because it was not just pole axes or something. Because again, infantry stops cavalry fundamentally with pikes. That's the thing. Pole axes and other blunt trauma weapons are mostly like when cavalry has stopped, you can pour on them, but the point is stopping the damn cavalry, which is something that again there was achieved by the softening up of the advancing line by the archers, but the men-at-arms having actually the greater credit absorbing that freaking charge, which again is something that you do not want to leave to witness, unless you have something that in fact are more important in your own life to fight for, which it's how it normally should be. So this thing surprised me a lot, but at least Shadiversity says something interesting regarding the fact that, of course, the archers could, when blocked by the infantry, could fall on the enemy flanks. But again, this thing of countercharging, especially if you are infantry, because that's the specific example he makes it even later in the same video, it's not the thing. Cavalry did charge sometimes by abandoning the line where the infantry was, and if they were broken, they kind of tried to pull back and to remain in this corridor between the infantry wings to kind of halt the enemy attack. But if the enemy attack broke the cavalry further, also the infantry lines dissolved, because there was no way they could make it alone against cavalry, right? So, but if you want to stop a cavalry charge as infantry, you stand still and very, very tensely, so you don't advance to counterattack, to essentially losing the intrinsic advantage that defense provides you, and the same reason why you actually dismounted your men-at-arms to intercept the enemies, that is also numerically superior, like in the case of Chrissy. So that's one I honestly didn't like. The same thing is repeated, in fact, later when he says, like, you can deploy, say, the best way to deploy missile troops. He always talks about archers, by the way, just to tell you. They never talk about missile or crossbow or something. It's always archers, right? So I presume that there is that deep passion for archery, especially longbows. But again, which I love myself, but were just, again, somewhat equivalent to other weapons, and at least surely their employment as such was not decisive per se, as we were just saying. Not just like not even crossbow was, for that matter, for the aforementioned ultra repeated reasons. But he says, like, if you have archers, let's say like him on a hill, on an elevated position, that of course gives you some edge, because of course of the greater, exploiting the acceleration of force of gravity to make it fall, projectile fall from the above on the enemy. So on an approaching enemy, so that is useful. And he says again, in this situation, when you have archers in the front line, which I don't know in any other circumstance, you may have infantry in reserve that can run down the hill to intercept the enemy that wants to reach your archers. I mean, what kind of tactics is this? I've never seen it, honestly. In the entire medieval history, there is a deep misconception about the entire thing. In that position, what you really want to do is deploying exactly in the same way, like with the infantry in the center, cavalry in the center, whatever you have, and the missile troops either on the flanks or in the rear, and exploiting the combined arms capacity of that. Right, I don't doubt that in smaller engagements this could happen somehow. In skirmishes, hit and run attacks, everything can happen. But again, pitched battles, this thing doesn't make any sense. I mean, you would disrupt your infantry order just to run back and forth, downhill, uphill, just to shield your own light infantry that is inferior to you as a heavy infantry, and tiring yourself, exhausted. What kind of tactic is that? I understand that if you have, let's say, maybe light cavalry, it would be a thing. Like if you have really lots of archers on the hill, and you have a few light cavalry that is, where to fight against your own archers, inferior to them on the flanks, or vice versa, instead if the light cavalry is stronger, have it in the center and using your archers on the flanks or on the rear. But this thing, honestly, doesn't make actually much sense at all. And he talks about Hastings. Maybe he was inspired by that, I don't know, but that's not what happened in that battle. In that instance, he repeats a bit of what I criticized before. First of all, he says something like, the Normans tried to shower the Anglo-Saxons with arrows, but nothing happened because the shield wall held. Well, I don't think the Normans were hoping to break the Anglo-Saxon shield wall just by using archers against them. As I already said, this is not a thing, right? If battles had been won just by the possibility of archers breaking in the enemy formation, medieval armies would have been largely made up of archers defeating all the other arms, and this is not the thing. Archers were also quantitatively less like missile troops than the other infantry, except, I must give you that, in the 100 Years' War, when the longbows actually were in disproportionate number compared to the men-at-arms, and that's also one of the reasons why that reinforces what I'm saying, because the longbow there was necessary in very large quantities to make that actual difference, right? Whereas most armies were made up essentially of like cavalry was elite numerically but qualitatively decisive. Then there were lots of other melee infantry, and then less missile troops than melee infantry. This is in Western Europe how it normally is, and this is true also by the time of Hastings, right? So of course, at the time of Hastings, let's say we're still in a time in which cavalry could be in fact halted by infantry. I think Hastings, in spite of the fact that the Anglo-Saxons lost, is a very good example of that, because as we were saying before, if there had been an intrinsic disadvantage of the Anglo-Saxons in fighting just with infantry against cavalry, would have not fought like that. They would have not fought at all. Like, Normans would have just marched to England, and that would have been over, because they would have not had any sufficient arm to withstand, right? Instead, this is a moment that lasts up until the mid-12th century, in which cavalry is generally stronger as an arm, but still finds infantry that is able to hold it, right? And Hastings is a very good example, because Anglo-Saxon infantry, by the way, was very tough, and because that was, by the way, the best they had, right? So no, the Normans showered the Anglo-Saxon lines preemptively. We know they did a little damage in general, so this is true. Probably they thought archer fire would have been more effective, but they probably witnessed that the enemy shield wall was more resistant than thought, but not because they hoped it would break it, right? Just hoped to make more damage, right? And obviously would have had to charge with their decisive arm of cavalry, by the way, uphill, right? And against an enemy that, for having chosen that position, of course, was an important advantage on terrain-wise, but also shows that, in a strategic sense, it was kind of on the defensive, because it was leaving the initiative to the Normans, after all. And the fact that the Normans would shower them with archers is also part of this, was that the Anglo-Saxons didn't have as many, at least. And of course, Shadiversity knows this. He says it. And he says, again, that we don't know how deep the Anglo-Saxon line really was, so we don't know whether, if the Normans breaking into it would have been absorbed by the posterior ranks or whatever. This is kind of irrelevant, right? Even if, first of all, we don't know it, there is a reason why we don't know it, because it was not so important, as I was saying before. And it's an advantage, yes, but you also have to cover the width, and so given that we don't know these measures in general, we have to suppose it was kind of the average depth that was used. And then again, in medieval warfare, I believe me, I studied my share of battles, not just for what you can see on Schwerpunkt in my playlist, but much more for my job. And I never found a source that says, this battle, look, these guys were 12 ranks deep instead of 8. There was none of that. Right? Nobody gave a damn about it, because in the general cohesion and the formation, moral force, for example, is dramatically more important than how deep you deploy. Right? So, yes, it played a role in some ways. We just don't know it, and doesn't seem to have been so relevant after all. Right? After all, sources tell us much more than we think, just in a moral sense, that we instead tend to reduce just to the mechanistic, structural side of the story, in other words, the materialistic one, which is frankly the least important in warfare. There is also another passage in which he says, the weather is so important, if it rains, it can be a problem because of sudden terrain, whatever. Yeah, I mean, this also plays a role. It can be the cherry on top that may shift the balance, yes, but in in a practical sense, it's almost ininfluent, right? Rain or even say if the terrain is heavily snowed, it can't start really be a problem. The battle will probably be fought also in a different ways. I know battles that because of snow were carried out with extreme chaos for 3 days in a row and so on. But generally speaking, things like rain do not really affect dramatically warfare, both strategically and tactically. Maybe tactically they can't cause certain specific, terrain changes that are apparently more relevant, at least from what we get from the sources, but in practice we hardly know how relevant they were. It's like those people said, the Mongols went away from Hungary because we discovered from dendrochronology that it was very rainy in some place somewhere around, as if that had any minimal historical relevance of any sort. Let's leave aside the fact that the Mongols took over Russia in winter. And in terms of humidity between that or Vietnam, where admittedly they lost, but for other reasons, they knew pretty well how to keep their bowstrings well dry, and so the entire issue is, why it should be so important. Well, okay, they relied on more archery, but say there is no evidence of any sort that this was any relevant strategic measure to change anything, nor in battles, right? Also because in Europe they kicked ass in the first place, so as we were saying before, but why would that factor even exist? Like, what are the I say this as a rhetorical question to those people who support that. Why would it even, where is your historical proof that this was a thing? The modern historiography dismisses that also for example, the Genoese crossbowmen at Crécy. Generally speaking, archers knew how to keep, again, everything in order, and there may have been broader organizational issues, maybe that the train of their supplies had not arrived, they were not properly equipped. I mean, things that we simply not know that may have happened and that are in the broader set of difficulties that occurred in warfare. We know they would be statistically normal. By some degree, of course, not normal, meaning that it happened the majority of the time, but let's say that it could happen with important frequency. Also, battles at night, at some point, I think Shadiversity says that, well, battles at night were not really fought. I mean, just incursions, ambushes, things like that could have something like it, attacking at dawn, but you need light in the first place, and just instinctively, you don't take the risk of not knowing what the hell is happening, which is pretty complicated also to assess in daylight, and at night normally you don't fight. Unless, again, you don't know the path, etc. It's a sort of coup or anything. It did happen often. There are interesting battles, especially seizing cities, fortifications at night, but pitched battles weren't fought at night. I don't know any. On the contrary, night was a convenient, say, fighting towards the end of the day was a pretty convenient way for allowing the retreats to occur with the cover of the darkness. And just eventually settling down. Of course, the day after would have been problematic because you hide, but you have to keep running away somewhere. And so, very cool things, but we can see them in some other videos sometimes. Also says that fighting in winter in a foreign country is so difficult. You can have illnesses and so on. Yeah, okay, but these things also happen. Yes, there is a general measure in favor, again, of the defender and so on, but it doesn't. It's a theoretical one. You don't know whether in most operations this wouldn't happen. And again, if there had been a major disadvantage, these operations would have not taken place, which was in fact the norm. Like, campaigns ended in autumn, and armies retreated during the winter. So this thing was just not so often, and if it could happen, because it did happen at times, it's because they could carry it out successfully for some reason. So yes, supply lines become thinner, it's a problem, etc. But if you're doing it, there is a reason why you're doing it, and a possibility, a capability for doing it. So again, yes, it's difficult, but what. That's exactly why they avoided it, generally speaking. So that's you see the pattern that I'm trying to instill here. And he does mix strategy, tactics, and logistics a bit. And of course, they are intertwined all the time. At every given moment, any tactical action is also a strategical one, after all. And logistically, it's also the same thing. Again, if you manage to bring your men to battle, and unless they're not literally starving at the moment, they have some energy that they will be able to spend for combat in a couple of hours. So, yes, since Shadiversity insists specifically on, we're talking about battles, right? He doesn't take in consideration the campaign so much. He makes that beautiful introduction, says, skirmishes are important, they're not represented in movies and so on. Yes, okay, but he hardly ever mentions a strategic or operational context, right? He does, but let's say digressing, right? Not saying, we're talking about something other than battles, right? And that's also, in fact, the topic of the video. That's where we also stayed ourselves. So that also could be relatively, it's like a bit in proportion to the tactical thing, the thing of saying, okay, you can have deeper formations, but not talking about battle lines, right? It's that same scale. Regarding sieges, he actually talks about this too, because he says at some point, if the enemy has all these logistical difficulties, strategic difficulties, you can simply entrench yourself in a castle and expecting for relief. And yes, again, that's how most battles were carried out, and also, they occurred in the first place, and also in the good season, mostly. So, as I was saying before, maybe I, study also contexts that were heavily urbanized, for example, and they, generally speaking, were also the contendants were very deeply intertwined among each other. So very often, yes, you're fighting on an enemy ground, but that broader difficulty of finding resources, supplies is relative, right? And mostly, again, if you engage into battle, it's because you have the possibilities of doing that. So the thing that I didn't like at all instead of the video, that after all, I say it's relatively uncontroversial for a general introduction, is the aforementioned problem of medieval battlefield mortality. And like Shadiversity doesn't really digress on it more than much, but it insists at least on the concept. It says, especially in comparison to the modern battlefield, like because there is artillery, so combat is bloodier, losses are higher. Modern battlefield, that doesn't seem to me like that. Like most combat is something extremely complex, where lots of other factors into play. Troops kill each other in very gradual ways, and that can be also quite shocking. I mean, even modern warfare is not more or less bloody than medieval warfare. And actually consider that we're talking about, of course, different types of battlefields, different types of tactics. In medieval times, as up to the end of the 19th century, the battlefield were full, right? Because formations were thick, compact, whereas with rifled barrels and machine guns, automatic weapons, the thing ends in that fashion. However, it doesn't really change the thing, because I suspect the broader bias is towards as it often happens, like in the broader military history community, is that people focus so much on again, not the wall, but the single details, and present that those work for the entire system. It doesn't, right? If you fight on a kind of divisional scale, you realize that more or less the bloodshed is the same. You send these blocks against one another, and how they kill themselves doesn't really affect the degree of mortality you can do. That depends on how much intensity the war really has per se, and that's what mortality is decided by. And in medieval battles specifically, because we could digress also on the other operations, but in medieval battles you had, again, in the most important pitched battles, 30,000, 20,000 men from both sides. Again, these are rare, but don't think that smaller engagements didn't happen, also in the thousands and tens of thousands. It was relatively frequent. It's not true that it was rare at all. What you have is that this two blocks that hold, again, in their complexity, one against the other until one breaks. Shadiversity exemplifies it well in the end, where there is this graphic pressure with he uses with the Lego props, and it's interesting. And then one side breaks, because it breaks morally, and after that, actually, plain butchery followed. And I can give an endless list of actual battles and sources, not randomly picked, but structurally picked, because that's what I had the fortunate privilege of doing, that tell us that there was a mortality of even up to 20-30%, and plus the captured. It really depends. These were very high numbers, of course, very high figures, but let's say it would be normal for one guy out of 10 to be knocked out, right, in engagement. This depends, of course, also how you pursue and all these things, and consider that many people, of course, were captured at the time. But this doesn't mean that the battle with 10% mortality from one side is not a high high mortality rate. It's actually very high, even for modern standards. So maybe I don't know if this video will ever be watched by Shadiversity, etc. But I can again provide with the figures. So I'm not trying to argue this. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm literally saying it for the sake of disclosure. We know this, and it's not the case. Again, there is this negative prejudice towards the Middle Ages, were allegedly more brutal than other times. But if you look at the bigger bloodsheds, you realize that the mortality was the same. And this is an important thing to say, because while it is true that armies were larger in, say, especially modern contemporary times, sometimes also in ancient times, it's because polities were more compact than in the Middle Ages at some level, and not entirely always true. The Middle Ages were really comparable most with the ancient, great part of the classical or Hellenistic Roman period. Of course, you see, let's say, more bloodshed more frequently, say, battles in which several tens of thousands of troops, like in Napoleonic Wars, of course, are very bloody. But if you take the relative figures, you also realize that yes, they're not particularly more bloody, because that's what the mortality rate really is, right? It's not the absolute amount of troops, but the number of troops over the total. It's not higher than medieval times. And in medieval times, in this sense, pitched battles of larger numbers could be rarer to see such an absolute bloodshed in that occasion. But again, if you take from this larger engagements included and the smaller ones, again, mortality was pretty high. So I don't really see any room for this idea. And next to this, Shadiversity backs this by saying, most battles did not end to, with men fighting to the last. Which ones normally do in the entire history of warfare, right? The entire history of warfare sees the same thing. These two blocks clash against each other. One breaks, the other pursues it, and that's it, and the bloodshed follows. In the Middle Ages, I don't understand. Well, is it a prerogative of the Middle Ages that people fled and were pursued and surrendered and routed? I don't know what did happen in Roman times, what did happen in Napoleonic time. It happened the same thing, right? So even today, it happens the same exact thing. So I don't understand this concept really, as if medieval battles were somewhat softer. At some point, it says, well, you see, there was armor, and not like that could absorb most of the blows. It didn't kill you. It's not like today that there is a sniper bullet that can kill you. What does to have to do with that, right? It's not the weapon. It's the tactics. It's the same thing that you said before, actually, in the video. You have all that enmassed infantry, mostly, that is going to be run and cut down like grass. And you have, I see it in the major battles. You have tens of thousands of losses between killed, wounded. The wounded are not counted so much, but the prisoners. But the kills are very high. And normally in clashes between tens of thousands of men, you have thousands of kills. And that's, again, the same kind of rate you find in other later eras. So I don't understand that. I think there is maybe this happens when you don't study other warfare. I maybe space more in times, and most of my the reason why I appreciate it is that I talk about old military history, not just and I have some kind of comparative diachronic vision of the same. And I don't even as a medievalist, I don't consider the Middle Ages as a thing. There was no Middle Ages, there's no medieval warfare, other than the fact that we decided that from a certain arbitrary point to another, we call it Middle Ages for reasons that have to do mostly with our mental problems than else. And that was just warfare as it was always thought, right? So he also says, the enemies that the route can be pursued, but only so far, and the enemy can reform. Well, that's pretty rare. As I was saying before, there is a big psychological shock. That is all the force that you have invested for bringing such enormous, bulky, costly systems like an army of that size are annihilated on the field. So all the motivation that you had politically is destroyed, because strategically the enemy proved that the best you could put together, which was what normally is put together to counter the enemy, as we've seen, the odds were are pretty balanced in warfare. The larger the engagement, are wiped out on the field, and so you have less forces now, and how can you hope to resist? Like, if not entrenching, and again, because you are weaker, right? You were strong as long as you had the possibility of meeting the enemy in open field, because that's what means to have a strategical superiority. If you resort to guerrilla and holding castles, it means you have passed the initiative to the enemy. You are just weaker. Like, that's the entire point of the story. It doesn't mean that the war cannot be won at that point, because again, everything military is purely political. So one decides for another reason that theater is not interesting to bail out, but militarily wise, from a strictly military point of view, it means that you are inferior and you're going to be taken out. And in fact, medieval battles were also, in that sense, very, very impacting, because very often you wipe out an enemy army. Well, you can conquer plenty of land, of castles, and those are very hard to storm. And this will simply, after such defeats, doesn't just take to shut yourself down in a castle. You will basically simply negotiate the surrender, because at that point the enemy has the upper hand on the area that has just acquired, and so it will last for a while before the situation can be reverted. And so simply the country will open to your advance if you can keep to advance. This is absolutely true, as the same Shadiversity pointed out. It's hard to prolong the campaign. These armies cost a lot, but the effect is radically impacting, and the reason is because the enemy forces were wiped out largely on the battlefield, to the point that, to the critical point for which even the survivors that were surely the majority, like in the normality of warfare, the majority of people survive battles, but still they will not be enough to take on that same enemy at the moment, at least. Shadiversity makes also an example about Bannockburn that resumes a bit the things he said. He makes the first example, that is the fact that Robert Bruce had fundamentally won a first engagement days prior to the major one, but he was toying with the idea of retreating because the English were still 2-1 numerically. And he says at a point, I'm amazed by the fact that battles are decided by little things, such as one side deciding to retreat. Such a little thing, right? That's first of all a strategic decision, and it's not a little thing at all. It's the entire purpose why you are there. It's not an option. It's what the entire political and social establishment brought you there to be, because what the enemy can oppose to you is, something you're not going to tolerate. So, of course, it's a critical risk decision, but it's hardly a little thing to retreat. And what does this have to do with the battle? If you retreat, there is no battle, right? So here I see, like, probably from a theoretical point of view, there is something that doesn't work. The other episode is one guy from the English side in that occasion crossing to the Scots, telling them essentially that the English morale was low. And so apparently bringing the Scots to somewhat accept the battle for that reason. Now, I don't know the source exactly, but just considering, because I've been reading sources from the Scottish Wars, and I will make a video about Bannockburn. I already made one about Stirling Bridge and so on. Also about Scottish infantry, if you're interested. I have a well placed about Scottish warfare. But let's say it's hardly because one guy crosses over and says the English are demoralized that you just, okay, so we will fight now. Yeah, sorry, I was wrong. It doesn't really happen like that. So the fact that Shadiversity is amazed by the battles are decided by little things such as these is, the fact is that they're not decided at all by such things. There are massive sets of things that decide the outcome of a battle, right? And whether to fight one or not. So to me, he mixes a bit things in the process. Like, for example, he says at some point you will use cavalry to ambush. Well, how? Right? In larger engagements, I never seen this. Like, you can, in a forested area, in valleys, in places, you can't use cavalry to, of course, ambush the enemy. Also, in the sense that there may be a road that is crossing and you can catch them by surprise. But why cavalry specifically? Why can't be an army, as they all were, also the small detachments, all tactically complete? Yes, light cavalry is mobile, can lure the enemy, but also can do less, as we've seen on the battlefield against him, especially if he is heavy and more numerous. So you can't kind of, again, pave the road for his movements, as Shadiversity says at the beginning of the story. But let's give the adequate hierarchical, relevance to the various arms and what they can do and why. The whole thing is intertwined. It's not just an episodic step-by-step situation where just one factor played in that single step. It may play more or less, but the entire strategic balance is what has driven that thing in the first place, into which these efforts are subordinated to, and can of course play a part of that. But it's, there is a much bulkier base to this. He also says battles could last days sometimes. It depends what you mean by the battle, because the battle is the actual tactical engagement. So if there is, like in Bannockburn, a previous clash where also infantry, if I'm not wrong at that point, departed as a detachment and avoided the English encircling the Scots. It's a very interesting strategic situation, but it's not a battle, right? It's not, let's say the battle is the single engagement, and that's what basically that gets down to. Of course, the same battles can be split into smaller engagements if you want, but by approximation, the entire, let's send the entire army in, and it will be over before the sun sets. Well, that's basically the battle, and it's kind of very well outlineable, both from a tactical and a strategical point of view during a campaign. And so Shadiversity concludes by saying that TV and films do not understand the fundamentals. The fundamentals are really something that you acquire with theory. I suggest specifically von Clausewitz, the Filmkriege, read, translated, studied, because, let's say, there is this and that, but not eventually giving the right measures and still having a bias of some sort, as we all do again, but in some cases very unbalanced, that to the point that that is the basics gotten wrong. Well, let's not pretend that the problem are movies or TV in general. The problem is people. The problem is people that do not study and that should say things that are actually more correct in the same TV and movies that are not definitely where you would like to get information about history or about anything else, but just enjoying the artistry of, if they have any, which the recent ones from 20 years in my opinion do not have, for multiple reasons, mostly commercial ones, but it still connected with people's overwhelming ignorance, which is the actual problem of the entire civilization. Let's not blame TVs and movies, because TVs and movies are designed around the people, and people do not understand shit about anything most of the time, and I literally mean it. So again, I talk for I don't know how more than 2 hours, so I don't want to cheat by saying I debunked such much more successful and truly enjoyable channel than mine, which I highly esteem in general because of whoever can bring close let's say the audience to these topics is definitely welcome. This also produced my video, so I know that YouTubers sometimes make war with each other, but I honestly am in totally friendly terms with anyone. I just am used to say exactly what I think, so I'm not going to, let's say, cover up, let's say, if there is some mistake or something. It's like the Outlaw King, I said, review before, right? I cannot say that's an historically accurate thing, right? What does it mean in the first place to be historically accurate? Where the standards are? I can simply hire the standard, and it sucks. Military-wise, it's ridiculous. That charge, that the battle is just disgusting. In strictly military historical terms, it's just ridiculous. And I meet people that are supposedly also following me, etc. Sometimes they say, the Alexander's charge at Gaugamela in Alexander by by what's his name? Well, I forgot that, but you know what I mean. It's utter crap, and people all know how. Why? Because you're like an emotional child that gets hyped and does not even understand what a cavalry charge is supposed to be on the basis of what we actually know pretty well. You don't need wizards telling you how cavalry charges were actually carried out. It just takes, to read a pair of books and to try to understand it, read somebody that at least studied them in depth. Stone, yes, that's the thing. So I personally, always am open in theory to any kind of, response or anything. Just I'm just not getting myself involved more than much because, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, I don't really make this kind of content, but sometimes, again, considering the impact certain videos have, and I admit it also because I make a lot of videos that I think are much more insightful regarding to the topic, but they're less successful. I say it, this may be a good reason for somebody searching for this content to also come across mine and say, well, this is maybe something, right? And as but I don't mean it in a, let's say, Shadiversity makes bad things, you don't have to watch them. No, absolutely not. I advise you to watch them. If anything, reflecting, if you have listened to my video and what I said and what he says and how he says it and how I say it, and understanding how we are here for this. Like, we all want to learn. We all learn, right? I also had to listen to Shadiversity's video twice to list all the things that I thought were, unbalanced rather than wrong. Right, you see, that's the point. I mean, the basics are right? There are just some, mostly right? That's the thing. But still, there is some corrections to be made. And just right now, I remember that in my digressions, I didn't say what I thought about siege warfare used in pitched battles. I will just conclude by saying this, that yes, I met this, and they basically shot like with ballistas, etc., together with the crossbowmen, basically from the behind of the infantry, of the heavy infantry wings, and they just just during sieges, because during sieges they did exactly the same thing against the enemy battlements, and that was mainly to suppress the guys at the top, while the dismounted knights basically were the stormtroopers and stormed the enemy walls. And so it was mostly suppression fire, and especially from these smaller ballistas and other tormenta and other machines, it's said, that are witnessed in battle, in open field. And there's nothing strange about that, because again, if you have an army that is, as often it happened, they were engaging because one was forcing the siege block. Well, at least one head was normally loaded in this kind of artillery. So yes, trebuchet fixed on the ground, that as kind of precision artillery against the enemy fortifications is one thing, but this other mobile ones actually really not, and they are witnessed in the battles. They were not even so radically significant or even there. They were surely not more important than crossbow fire, and as we have seen, the light infantry also was not decisive over the cavalry, so they were not so relevant, but they did exist. And they probably, yes, weren't like this enormous catapults like in movies with giant balls of fire thrown against the enemy. No. I remember about this too, that he says literally that it is stupid to think that an enemy on the battlefield would stay firm while it's bombed by artillery. I don't know how to say that, but this is not true. First of all, the enemy had to maintain a formation to cope against the enemy one. And so given that artillery was not so impacting in terms of human losses they could inflict, of course they would stay where they were, when they were under fire. What do? You simply move an infantry wing, or you send cavalry away during the fight because there is a guy who's shooting at you with a ballista, while there are tens of thousands of quarrels that fall in 1 hour, and you have just to counter that equally. And likely they had that artillery too. So no, it's not stupid at all, and the enemy is not just flexible. An army is not just something can jump around battlefield. Like how do you deploy, and the position you have is that one, right? If the enemy again had a terrible artillery, a repetition artillery like machine guns in the 19th century, of course they would have not even taken the field. But artillery was what it was, and yes, it was used also in open field, and the enemies would stand under fire because being hit by a ballista arrow was not, let's say, more likely than being killed by a quarrel of a crossbowman. So it's a thing that frankly I don't understand, and that's also perhaps mixed with that misunderstanding of the power of missile troops. For not talking about the fact that, but this is a more closed battlefield, that there are instances of, for example, armies holding a bridge that remain under ballista fire. Literally, this where artillery was brought to dislodge them from the bridge, and they wouldn't leave it, right? For the same reason that, eventually they lost, actually, and probably because of that, but they had thickly packed infantry, so they could use this kind of ballistas. First of all, they were mobile enough, even. And so, as we've seen, most of artillery really was, because most of artillery was smaller than the bigger ones, and they could be brought on a battlefield. And they stood firm, taking losses until they were eventually overwhelmed not by the artillery, but by other forces. Of course, after they had been softened up, and after a fight that they were still able to put up. So yes, the enemy would stand firm, also under artillery fires. They would on castles, battlements, and so on. And the bridge is some kind of fortification in that sense, too. So it's not open field, but still there were there was this kind of artillery in open field. So I would conclude it here. I'm sure I've missed something, but I think the video was clear. You can follow it. I touched basically everything about that. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.